Sea of Stars is an indie game released mid-2023 by Sabotage Studio after their last and critically acclaimed game, The Messenger. Sea of Stars released to similar critical reception and even awards. And I hate this game. Like, genuinely hate it. This is my least favorite game of all time. I know that might sound like a ludicrous statement, and to an extent it is. I mean, just by looking at this footage you may find it hard to believe that this is a bad game. And you have every reason to doubt me. This game does look really, really good. I thought it looked good. And I guess that's the thing when you get down to it. While I firmly believe this to be a bad game, you can only hate a bad game so much for being bad. I'll admit, I've played games that are objectively worse than this. Sea of Stars did much more and worse for me to hate it so much that I would confidently declare it my least favorite game. But I really thought this would be good. Not just good, but really good. The visuals were great. The setting looked interesting. I loved their previous game. It's a Chrono Trigger inspired game that actually got one of Chrono Trigger's composers on as a guest. How could a game with everything working in favor of it be bad? Well, it's actually quite simple. You just have to fuck up everything else. And ultimately, that's why I hate this game. It feels like a betrayal of my expectations, the money I bought it with, and worst of all, my goodwill towards the developers. And my faith that Sabotage can make a good game after this in any genre has sunk far lower than it ever should have. Now, I have always wanted to talk about my grievances toward this game in a video before, but I never had a good reason to. Not helping the fact was the knowledge that talking about it meant playing it again just to record footage. So I kind of just held off on it while life kicked me in the nuts for a year. But things changed after I learned there was a big update that added new features to improve the overall experience. Now, just looking at what was changed didn't fill me with confidence that it would be noticeably improved. But it at least gives me reason to make this video in the first place. The main reason I'm not confident is because the changes listed aren't for things that address my biggest issues with the game, just the small ones. Of course, my opinion could also completely change after a second playthrough without any major changes. It won't, but it could. I guess there's not much else to do for an intro. Let's just jump straight into the game itself. How bad could it really be? So, as you can see, Sea of Stars is an RPG, and as I said just a minute ago, is primarily inspired by Chrono Trigger. In some cases, it's a bit on the nose, what with the overworld that leads into subworlds where battles take place. Battles aren't random encounters and take place on the map instead of transitioning to a separate battle screen. A separate world that's much more technologically advanced and desolate compared to the main one, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, there's one thing you probably had on your mind since you first saw footage for this game. And yes, you're absolutely right, the visuals are phenomenal. I have little else to say about that. The presentation of this game is easily one of the strongest aspects of it. I'll touch on the music later though. I have more specific things to say about that. Alright, let's start the game. And the first thing that needs talking about is, of all things, the file creation. Yes, really. First, we pick our main character. Zale, the blade dancer who follows the guardian god Solon, and Valir, the monk who follows the guardian goddess Luana. Now, you'll notice that the game explicitly states that this choice can be changed at any point and does not affect the story. Now, I must say, for a game inspired by Chrono Trigger, it is a bold decision to start the game with this, considering that game may as well be the original Choices Matter game. But whatever, not every game has to be Undertale. Linear narratives can be just as good or better than non-linear ones. Anyway, I picked Valir because I already chose Zale on my first playthrough. Next, we have our first big change to the game. One that actually addresses an issue I've had since my first playthrough, and it kind of fixes it? Let me explain. An issue I've always had with this game is the difficulty. Not because it's too hard, or even too easy. The game was a bit too easy, mind. It got a bit mind-numbing at points. The few times it felt more difficult than normal rarely felt fair, and I could probably count the game overs on playthrough 1 with half a hand. That aside, my core issue has to do with how they designed the difficulty options. You see, instead of your typical set to easy or hard prompt, Sea of Stars chose to reinvent the wheel and have you adjust difficulty through these relics that can be toggled at any point. This is just a glorified second option screen, and if this was just how you set the difficulty, that'd be fine. It's noticeably more unintuitive and cumbersome than a typical preset difficulty, but it would be fine. But there's a good number of relics, including difficulty-based ones, that have to be unlocked. I know the most significant ones for difficulty adjustment are given at the start, but do I really have to explain why this is a problem? There's a relic that essentially turns the game into hardcore mode. Let's say, hypothetically, you don't have it at the start. What are you supposed to do if you want to play the whole game that way? Tough shit. Play through the entire game on easy mode up to the point where you can obtain it. Now, the recent update does attempt to remedy this by having a choice between 3 difficulty options before the game starts. However, this, while appreciated, does not address the core issue, because, again, this doesn't work the way it typically does. This isn't a setting that's independent of the relics, these are just relic presets. This is definitely an improvement, but what do you think about it? What does it say about your game's fancy, unique, special TM design when it's improved by being more cliché? Also, I picked hard so the game wouldn't be mind-numbingly easy, and guess what it eventually became? Only difference is that in the early game I had to deal with some cheap nonsense. Like, look at this. What did I do wrong here, outside of having inefficient stats? This difficult relic preset also has flat-out unnecessary and artificial means of making the game harder. Namely, no items during combat, and rest sites don't recover you for shit. Look, I'd go on, but we have an entire story to talk about, so let's just... I have to talk about the story. Fuck! We open with a rather ancient-looking man. He calls himself the Archivist, and he's apparently well-versed in alchemy. He talks about how he's been researching countless timelines, all in search of something, a ray of hope, so to speak. A story that may lead to the end of the evil doings of the Fleshmancer. The Archivist will more or less serve as a narrator at certain breaks in the story, but he will be a more significant player in the story later on. There's not much to say about this. He mostly just gives vague allusions to what's going to happen every time we cut to him, so I won't be bringing up these breaks as they're not important. The one thing of note is that this is the first mention of our main villain, not even a minute in. And I have to say, Fleshmancer sounds a little awkward. It's effective, you already know what this guy's deal is, but it's still awkward. Probably because you're mixing words from 2 different languages, like, does this world also have Firemancers? But hey, it's an easy fix, just call him the Sarkamancer or something similar. Anyway, our story begins with the 2 children of the solstice. So this is another change made in the update, and it does help with the pacing quite a bit, even if the change is rather insignificant. You see, originally the game opened with the 2 mains on the mountain trail. After reaching the nearest rest site, we flash back to their childhood. Now, we start with the childhood section, and even get our first taste of combat immediately. Again, it's a definite improvement, probably the most significant improvement made, which is weird to say when I never took much issue with this before. It wasn't noteworthy, but also not a glaring flaw like at least 90% of the story, which they didn't change, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. So we're introduced to Zale and Valir as kids, as well as their best friend Garl, and the village of Mooncradle. You see, children of the solstice are brought here by Eagle delivery, I guess, and above Mooncradle is Zenith Academy, where these children are trained to be solstice warriors. The solstice warriors are peacekeepers, more or less, with their main mission being fighting what's known as dwellers, which are minions created by the Fleshmancer, a very special breed that are much more powerful than the average fodder. All of his minions are severely weak to solstice magic, but dwellers are so strong that this magic is virtually ineffective. Thus, solstice warriors vanquish these creatures during an eclipse, which is when their magic is at their most powerful. And this is important, since if left unchecked, dwellers will grow stronger and eventually turn into a far stronger and more dangerous monster not so subtly called a World Eater. And that's more or less the premise. Zale and Valir will train to be Solstice Warriors, fight Dwellers alongside the others in the Order, save the world, and if the Archivist is to be believed, these two will eventually defeat the Fleshmancer himself and end his schemes for good. So, let's see how this plays out. Our protagonists are daydreaming with Garl about adventure and such, and they leave their secret hideout to meet Sorry, I don't know what came over me. This is Brugaves and Erlina, fellow Solstice Warriors and the protagonist's mentors. We're also introduced to the headmaster, Moraine. And that's all the Solstice Warriors we will see in this game. You see, not long before the main duo were brought to Mooncradle, when the mentors were still young and the Solstice Order was at its peak, they all went to cleanse the Dweller of Strife. They were successful, but well over a dozen warriors died in the fight, with Moraine barely being the only survivor. So yeah, the Order has seen better days. The main duo want to go to the academy as soon as possible, so they plan on entering the Forbidden Cavern, hoping that the full moon will compensate for their lack of magical skill and allow them to open the entrance. This will hopefully impress Moraine and convince him to let them in somehow. Garl also accompanies them to the monster-filled cave. What are you talking about? This can't possibly backfire. Yeah, Garl got stabbed in the eye. Impressed by this brilliant display of recklessness, Moraine takes the main duo to the academy and they say their goodbyes to Garl, as they won't see him until their training is over. This takes 10 years, and their relationship doesn't change when they reunite. Is it even worth emphasizing the fact that they're separated right after this incredibly traumatic event? Garl's last memory of his dear friends for a whole decade is losing his eye after doing precisely the kind of stuff they daydream about, and it results in zero development or change. Now, I can already hear someone arguing that he does change, because he did a bunch of learning and survival training in the time that passed to prepare himself for adventure, and I'm being unfair. Here's the thing though, that kind of development, based on how he acts in the few scenes prior, was already in character for him. When I say this incident has no effect on him, I mean it. Evident in the fact that this is never mentioned at any point in the story, at least as far as I remember, let alone mentioned as something that had an effect on Garl. And frankly, that's unacceptable. Believability is an important part in character writing, and while I believe that the Garl we see at the start would go through the time skip training he does, I cannot believe that this gruesome incident would have no lasting effect on him. Anyway, the Academy. I'm skipping over the majority of this because it's mostly fluff, tutorials, and relaying information that I mentioned earlier. Only things worth mentioning is that Garl sneaks in to give the main duo cookies, and there's a big emphasis on making these magic cloths for some reason. Like, it's said that they provide protection against the Fleshmancer minions, but this has blatantly undermined the fact that your party will have non-Solstice warriors that do fight the minions, including Dwellers. And despite any emphasis put on the cloth, they will be relevant to the story for a grand total of one scene before the very end of the game. Devs, you aren't forced to waste people's time. Valir and Zale pass the exam and are given their first mission. Go see the Elder Mist so they can learn how to use magic without using magic, whatever that means. Then, go to Sleeper Island, get a ship en route to Wraith Island where they, as well as the other three warriors, will cleanse the Dweller of Woe. And so, our heroes set off. Everyone is there to see them off, but Garl is suspiciously absent because he joins later. Yeah, if you thought I would structure this video in a way that would keep anything a secret for later, you are mistaken. Spoilers will be sudden and without warning. Anyway, they go through the cavern, fight a big worm. I didn't notice this while playing, but the war boss feels familiar for some reason. Oh well. They reunite with Garl and meet the Elder Mist. The two dunk their napkins in the water, this is the one scene they're relevant for, and now they can do the non-magic thing, which amounts to a new gameplay mechanic. Oh yeah, I almost forgot this was a video game. Suppose now is a good time to talk about the gameplay. This is a turn-based RPG, so once you're in an enemy encounter, you have to defeat them by taking turns doing whatever action you choose. Simple stuff. Turn progression is a bit different than usual. When it's your turn, you can choose anyone available to act, and you can freely switch your available party members around with your standby members. These numbers represent the amount of actions the player can take before the enemy attacks. After attacking, the enemy will remain docile until the next turn cycle, but there are exceptions. A new turn cycle, by the way, starts after all living party members take action. and they can't be swapped out if they already went, which can be important to consider if there's a team combo attack that you need to make use of. Seriously, did you think a Chrono Trigger inspired RPG wouldn't feature this? The actions you can take are as follows: basic attack, skills, combos, use item, and ultimate. Your basic attack actually does quite a bit. Obviously, it deals small, costless damage, but it also restores MP, which you need for skills. Additionally, these will generate 1 point of life mana, and any character can spend these to boost. Boosting will increase the damage or healing effect of the next action, in addition to adding a damage type that correlates with the character using it, so long as their move doesn't already have that damage type. So, it's pretty useless for Garl. But I like this mechanic. It reminds me of a similar thing in Octopath Traveler, and actually really like the battle system in that game. You also have to make use of skills. They cost MP but deal more damage or support the party. Standard affair. Skills can also be strengthened or given additional properties through successful action commands. That's another feature. Similar to the Mario RPGs, you can press a button at the right time to enhance your skills, make your basic attack hit twice, reduce incoming damage, or make Moonrang and Venom Flurry go on for a very long time. Combo moves need combo points to use, which you get throughout the battle as well as by executing action commands or breaking locks. As long as the corresponding characters are on the field, you can use these. They are better than the normal skills and also recover MP for both characters. Using skills and spending combo points will also build an ultimate meter. Once full, one character can use it for a powerful, multi-hitting AoE attack with big, flashy, and slightly drawn-out animations. And finally, there's locks. When an enemy prepares a spell, a series of symbols appear representing damage types. Enemies already have resistances and weaknesses, but this is where damage types are most important. If an enemy completes a spell, it is very dangerous. But if you use the corresponding damage type during their charge time, the symbols, or locks, will break, decreasing the power of the spell more with each lock broken. And if you successfully break the whole lock, the spell is cancelled out entirely. In doing so, we'll need a healthy knowledge of what each skill and combo does, as well as executing action commands. For example, an enemy has a spell with 2 slash locks. Zale or Serai can break it in 1 turn by getting the second hit of their basic attack. All in all, makes for an interesting battle system, combining mechanics from multiple beloved RPGs with new mechanics to keep things fresh. Let's talk about why it sucks. Combo attacks? Great. At least it would be if they weren't hilariously limited. I said the meter fills over time, but it is very slow. You basically have to rely on locks to fill it. To make matters worse, you can only hold a max of 3 combo points when the majority of combos cost 2, so you don't get to use them very much. And that's to say nothing of ultimates. The meter fills so slowly and it doesn't carry over, so you really only get to use them for boss fights. So you don't get to do much fancy stuff, though a lot of the combos aren't very fancy to begin with. Rather than unique combinations of characters' talents and traits, they opted for the most literal combination of existing skills. And unless I'm missing something, they all reuse animations. So the combos aren't the most interesting, not helped by the fact that this also means they use the same action commands. And then there's your first combo. Like, I know that Chrono Trigger can also be guilty of what I'm talking about, but what is this? Was the creative team on a 4-month vacation? Because the animators clearly weren't. Oh, but I haven't finished talking about the battle system itself. Action commands are fine, but this playthrough especially convinced me that those do not lend themselves to Chrono Trigger style positioning. Even if you fully understand an enemy attack pattern, you are bound to mess up due to the positioning throwing you off. Eventually I started relying on audio cues more than visuals, but that doesn't help with the projectiles or other such attacks that makes up the timing. So you better pay attention to the half-second jump that indicates which character is being targeted, and don't even get me started on Moonrang. Oh, and remember what I said about basic attacks generating resources? Well, you may have noticed that your MP pool is very small. Starting out is only really enough for 1 skill, 2 if you're lucky. To make matters worse, a lot of the late game skills use much more MP than the others. But outside of equipping 1 special accessory, you can't increase MP generation. Now, when you combine that with the fact that breaking a full set of locks cancels a powerful enemy action, and exasperate it with the hard preset giving charging enemies a defense boost, what do you think you get? I imagine the devs thought it created an intricate system where every aspect matters. What it actually creates is possibly the most monotonous gameplay loop you can imagine, where you just spam basic attacks to build and maintain resources just to flawlessly break a lock set that isn't hard to figure out, and avoid all danger. Or as much danger as the game will let you, at least. And that's another thing. Every lock is beatable, but it doesn't stop the game from giving you unescapable spells, either because you can't get every enemy in a normal encounter, the boss immediately starting another spell that you lack the resources for, or just gives you one that's impossible to stop with the time given. And on top of that, the game never tells you that there's certain spells that can't be weakened and have to be completely broken, with no indication in the UI that differentiates the two outside of the power meter not decreasing. I am not joking when I say the locks almost single-handedly destroyed this game's chance of being fun. But it gets worse. Changes were made to the battle system in the recent update. One thing changed that's definitely an improvement is being able to keep your combo points after battle. For whatever reason, this wasn't a feature on launch and it was very annoying. One change that is definitively not an improvement is this.
Oh my goodness!
Yes, the geniuses at Sabotage decided that combat would be greatly improved by hiding locks on unseen attacks from unseen enemies. So remember that completely monotonous gameplay loop of spamming basic attacks to save resources for locks? Well, now add an extra layer of frustration. Depth. Where a new spell emerges and you're forced to spend resources just to see what you have to do to begin with. And it does not matter if a different enemy uses a spell you've seen before. You still have to reveal the locks. Certain skills have also been adjusted to have a reveal lock property, but that's basically useless because hitting a lock with any damage type will reveal all locks of that type for that spell, regardless if it's there. So an enemy can use a spell, you can hit its locks with whatever damage. It can use the same spell with a different lock set, and that damage type will still be revealed. And there's only 6 damage types anyway, so this also becomes an incredibly simple and, again, monotonous process. Christ, the battle system is terrible. I never expected this, but it just gets worse the more I think about it. So many parts to the battles and all of them working against each other. It's like taking fresh eggs, A5 Wagyu, and homegrown cabbage in order to make a vegan breakfast. It's an attempt to take things that work from other games and just combine them with no thought of how they would work together. And you know what? It feels pretty similar to other aspects of this game, like certain aspects of the story, for instance. It feels like this game was made by people who do enjoy RPGs, but have a ton of nitpicks with most of them, not dissimilar to what you would see joked about in memes. So we end up with the things they liked, and they also decided to axe the nitpicked aspects and just assumed it would make the game better. You know, like, oh, how funny is it we keep hoarding these items and never use them? Sea of Stars answered this by only letting you have a max of 10 usable items, or at least it did at first. I don't know if that changed. Everything from combo points not staying originally, the universal level up, the limited MP pool with basic attacks recharging it, freely switching party members mid-battle, and some of the story elements gives me this impression. Maybe it's just me, but I never saw stuff like that as inherently bad aspects of RPGs. And you know, I think that choosing to remove these in an effort to make the game better is going to take a lot more foresight and consideration than finding memes on Reddit making fun of these tropes. You know, call me crazy, but aren't RPGs of all kind pretty much defined by decision making? From what you do in battle, to what you equip, to the resources you choose to spend. Oh, wow, that's another point against the locks, isn't it? Because there's always a predetermined set of actions you need to take to break them. You don't really get to decide what you do in battle, do you? Man, isn't it crazy that pretty much the entirety of the main gameplay is brought down by the one major mechanic that's original? Something tells me that removing this mechanic would make this entire battle system better. Or at least it would be a good start at least. We still have a lot of issues to work out. So that was the long version. The short version is the battle system is a poorly conceived, self-contradictory mess that creates a boring, monotonous gameplay loop that only serves to worsen the experience. But I'll go out on a limb and say it's only the third worst part of the game. Probably. Remember, this is an RPG. The story is half the experience in these games. Mostly. And the story may seem simple now, but we haven't even left the starting island yet. Before they leave, they're instructed to use this route on the ground to proceed, and when they do... You know, I think that one trademark feature of bad writers is introducing something because they think it would be cool without considering the broader implications. Yeah, this is exactly that. For example, what exactly is it like for normal people when this can just happen out of nowhere? Is it even possible to keep track of time or have a reliable calendar? This isn't an illusion. They are literally moving the sun and moon. What exactly is the extent of this? Can a solstice warrior just cause the moon to fall and destroy an entire island? I know it's shown that the moons are much smaller than you would think, but the destructive power of an island-sized meteor cannot be understated. I really hope this can't happen, otherwise we better hope that the solstice warrior only consists of virtuous people. But enough speculating. Let's talk about how the way this is explicitly shown to work obliterates the narrative. As I've said, dwellers are so powerful that they're only made vulnerable during an eclipse. A total eclipse specifically. Now, even these can happen fairly often in our world. Often as far as astrological phenomena is concerned. But this bullshit makes the time between eclipses irrelevant. And you can't even say that this can't be used to create an eclipse, because the fact it can is a major plot point. What stopped the Solstice Warrior from going, okay, so there's been confirmed reports of a new dweller, so we're off to cleanse it. Lara, you're the weakest one, so you go hang out with the Elder Mist at the top and maintain the eclipse for the designated time. This may seem silly to complain about, but unless I'm mistaken, it's implied that dwellers get stronger over time or the more they consume. We don't get an idea of how fast they can grow. In fact, the sense of time throughout this game is a bit muddled. But remember that unchecked dwellers will become world eaters, and if enough time passes between eclipses for a dweller to become as strong as, say, the Dweller of Strife, then they need to be nipped in the bud as fast as possible. And if that's actually how the Dweller of Strife got that strong, then I guess the Solstice Order was too stupid to figure out this could happen. But it's fine, I'm sure it can't get worse for the Order later on. Anyway, the trio get the following prophecies from the Elder Mist. Zale will have to stare at the night inside him. Valir will one day create paths on water, and Garl will soothe a long tormented soul. Whatever. With this new knowledge in hand, our heroes set off to Sleeper Island. This doesn't seem like a very survivable form of transport. As the party sets off for ground level, we see them being watched by a mysterious assassin with the ability to make portals. And along the way, they see some ancient ruins and meet this girl, Teeks, a traveling historian. She has a special book here called a lore grimoire that can basically scan an object and write down its entire history within its pages. Why yes, this does have insane implications. But implications aside, Teeks herself and her book will be relevant to the story for a grand total of one scene before the very end of the game. What is this deja vu? Also, Teeks' actual purpose from a gameplay perspective is to give lore dumps. Some of these are just flavor for the rest of the story. Some of these explain something that's crucial to the main plot. None of them piqued my interest enough to actually read through all of them. So moving on. They arrive at a village of mole people who are all in a panic because the wind tunnels in the mine are being clogged by an earth mage. I did bring this up before, but back in the childhood flashback, Garl was talking about wanting to see this island's namesake, the Sleeper, a giant dragon of immense destructive power, and one that's kept asleep by the mole people, carving out caves that cause the wind to blow through and play a soothing melody. So the crew decide to help out because it's the right thing to do, and because the wind also powers the contraptions in this village, and they literally can't make it to the port town without helping. Not much happens here. You get an item that lets you blow large blocks, and these are literally just ice lighting puzzles in other games. And the game wants you to feel sympathy for the aforementioned Earth Mage. Ignore the fact that his irresponsible behavior could have resulted in an apocalypse. People were mean to him, therefore he is a good person. Oh, and for whatever reason, when they pass by the Sleeper, Garl doesn't care very much. Despite his enthusiasm stated before, it takes Zale pointing it out for him to notice. Just a weird moment. One fuller level later, the gang arrive at the port town of Brisk, and even though you're in a big and dense new town, you actually can't go anywhere you're not supposed to yet, because you have to meet this pirate crew who consists of— I'll be honest with you guys. There may be a few characters in this game that I genuinely hate. But even though I think most, if not every character in this game is badly written, I don't hate them for that reason. Like what I said at the start of the game as a whole. A character has to do something worse than be bad to be hated. So completely unrelated to that statement, the pirate crew. First is the captain, who bears a striking resemblance to the assassin from earlier. No relation. Ignore the fact that the captain is literally named Cliché. Ugh. I'll just call her Serai for the sake of simplicity. We also see the 3 members of her crew. Some are unimportant, some do influence the plot in a significant way. All of them are defined by having gimmicks in the place of actual personality that definitely don't get old after the first time. Keenathan really wants you to know that that's his name. Valtrade does this. And Yolande has 10 trillion middle names, but I guess got promoted to first mate after obtaining a second gimmick, and that second gimmick single-handedly makes her the worst character in the game. It's the thing that everyone everywhere, without exception, enjoys it every time it happens in anything. Say it with me now. Meta humor. Yep, half her existence is to randomly spout meta jokes related to tropes in other RPGs. And they all suck. In this first scene with the crew alone, you get so bombarded with these that on my first playthrough, I felt my soul wither along with my immersion. And on this playthrough, all I could think is, oh my god, please shut the fuck up. Now look, I get it. Indie games love doing their meta jokes and tongue-in-cheek references. I know that Sabotage already liked using meta jokes in their last game, and I understand that humor as a concept is very difficult to judge objectively. But even still, the meta jokes and humor in this game as a whole suck. The normal humor is easy to explain, it's just hard to discern if something's actually supposed to be funny or not. Hell, there's hardly any comedic moments whatsoever, but the meta jokes, which are clearly meant to be funny, are simply bad, and completely immersion breaking. There's no setup, there is barely a punchline, Yolande just interrupts the dialogue to basically paraphrase Reddit memes about RPG cliches, and to make matters worse, this often comes at the expense of other RPGs. Remember what I said about my suspicions about this game being made by people with RPG nitpicks? This is part of why I assume that's the case. Like, Yolande will joke about how we save overpowered items for later, but never use it. But this game's solution to that is to give you the best items at the very end, meaning you barely get a chance to use it anyway. And the jokes aren't funny, either. There's a reason I equated it to Reddit memes, because it may as well be. In fact, let's compare this to the kind of meta humor you see in their last game, The Messenger. First, one of Yolande's memes. When questioning the party on any tropes they have planned for their journey, she speaks of linear upgrades where each blacksmith is inexplicably better than the last, and how they will live in shacks despite selling single weapons for extremely high prices. That's it, that's the joke. Not only is this so disconnected from the rest of the scene that even the main duo are silent, but it's also completely tone deaf, because this game is also guilty of doing this? No, the northernmost shops aren't the ones with the best gear, but the gear in question still gets progressively better. No, this shopkeep doesn't live in a shack, but the village itself is completely desolate to the point it probably shouldn't have a functioning economy. And they accept your world's money on top of that. So where's the humor in this supposedly humorous observation? What's funny about pointing out tropes that you yourself partake in? You are not above these tropes just because you point them out. This is lampshading being masqueraded as humor. Oh, and you're especially not above these tropes if your solution doesn't make your game any better. Now let's compare that to an early joke in The Messenger. The protagonist, aka the Messenger, falls into a pit with seemingly no way out. But there's a magic gate you can enter leading you to the shop. After the shopkeeper spills some info about the climbing clause allowing you to climb and wall jump, from here you have the option to talk about this item leading to the following dialogue. Quite a bit to unpack. First, this dialogue is optional, so it doesn't interrupt the pace. Second, Messenger's remark that he feels he should have been able to do this is a nod to the fact that in classic Ninja Gaiden, this game's clear inspiration, allowed you to wall jump right out the gate. And the nods to Ninja Gaiden continue. The name John Gaiden speaks for itself, and it almost acts as a double joke about how people will jokingly call nameless protagonist John insert game title. And even if the references go over someone's head, this exchange still has some wit to it. Even though the Messenger himself gets his chances to break the fourth wall, he still acts as a bit of a straight man in these exchanges, while the shopkeeper acts as the snarky, knowledgeable one. And while the two of them aren't the most dimensional characters ever, this game is still able to use their contrasting personalities to get some comedic value. not saying the Messenger is the gold standard for meta humor, but when compared to its older, superior brother, Sea of Stars' meta humor is forced, obtrusive, and hypocritical. And the fact it all comes out of the mouth of a single character is why I'm confident in saying Yolande is the worst character in the game. Well, let me tell you, the position is hard fucking won. Actually, you know what game subverts RPG tropes infinitely better than this game? Final Fantasy Origin. And the best part is that I don't even need to break it down for you. This one clip speaks for itself.
I'm a dark elf, you see. And we dark elves...
Just tell us about the crystals.
This game isn't even that great. It's, it's okay. A solid chaos out of 10. Anyway, there's a negotiation to be done. The party still needs a ride to Wraith Island, and the pirates, who definitely aren't expecting them to arrive here, offer to take them for free if they win an arm wrestle. Of course, Valtrade can do this, so they lose. And now they need a favor. The pirates want them to go to this conspicuous but inaccessible dump to get something called a Coin of Undeath Accord. Once all said and done, the trip to the Wraith Island is theirs. They get it, and they're off. Also, if wind mages are important for propelling ships, makes you wonder if water mages would be more effective considering, the real-life physics reason why motorboats are better than sailboats, but whatever. It's here we also get a glimpse of what the pirates want the coin for, the Vespertine, a legendary ghost ship captained by a powerful wind mage, a ship that, according to what Yolande let slip, can even sail the sea of something. So an objective improvement to their dinky raft. And we arrive at Wraith Island, a spooky place full of zombies and depressed townsfolk. Why yes, the depressed people are described as coping, and yes, it does feel weird to see in this dialogue, especially when the dialogue as a whole is much more grounded comparing to something like The Messenger, with notable exception. But in fairness, they are using the word properly, so it's only the internet's fault for making it feel unnatural. The party still has some time before the rest of the Solstice Warriors arrive before the cleansing, but before they can settle in, a civilian is suddenly possessed and begins levitating to the haunted manor. The main duo want to help, but Serai protests, almost uncharacteristically. The party manages to catch up to the victim, but are unsuccessful in stopping them. But before he can breathe, Garl comes under the same spell, and Serai appears in assassin form and stops Garl with a sedative. Again, I'm not keeping it a secret that Serai and Cliché are the same, so I'll be summarizing this as if you already know that. By the way, how exactly does this poison work? The idea is simple. Prevent a mind-controlled individual from moving by sedating them. But would that even work in this case? Because the possession is clearly shown to cause people to hover. If it does work, does that mean every human already has the physical capacity to hover? Does it require their limbs to be functional? Does it require a functioning brain? Did the poison put him to sleep more or less? Because he already should be considering the whole mind control, and even if it does work that way, then how does it stop the hovering? I know it seems petty to focus on this tiny aspect, and it is, but it's an easy fix. Just use walking animations and these questions don't have to present themselves. The writer is thinking 2 steps ahead, but the story is being written 3 steps ahead. And even with all the very niche actions this game chose to animate in extreme detail, they couldn't spare any effort to use a walk animation. Or maybe they didn't consider what the visuals would tell us as opposed to the dialogue. Garl is saved but is still in danger, so they need to dispel the mind control before it's too late. Is that even possible? I hear you ask. And yes, it is. All they need is a MacGuffin that Serai just so happens to know about, and also just so happens to know about a necromancer that has one, who just so happens to be on this island, and just so happens to know how to get there. Holy contrivance, Batman! If I didn't know any better, I would say this was forced as an excuse to get the grappling hook and for Serai to spend the coin on something other than the Vespertine, because that definitely couldn't be done in the Dweller's Manor. And you know what? When I put it that way, that would make this plot a lot better. Think about it. There's no fetch quest to disrupt the pacing, there's much more logical method to save Garl, it gives the main duo a much more personal stake when they fight the Dweller of Woe, and it adds tension. But alas, the devs chose the first draft. Or at least I hope they didn't, because that would be beyond embarrassing. And oh boy, imagine if the MacGuffin was anywhere else they couldn't access. I must say, this is some of the writing I have ever seen. Oh yeah, during this part, the main duo learn a new battle skill. Zale gets one from the Zombie Duke, and Valere just learns it on her own, I guess. This is also the last skill they learn in the game. Oh boy, is it time to complain about the combat again? Yes. Each character gets 3 skills. Not 3 skills to learn, 3 skills, period, not including ultimates. So, if you remember how I talked about the monotony of the combat and perfectly understood what playing it would be like, now imagine what it's like when your options for combat are more limited than fucking Pokemon! I guess even with all the very niche actions this game chose to animate in extreme detail, they couldn't spare any effort to give just one extra skill to even just one party member. Or maybe they couldn't think of any. I don't know. Time for the cleansing. Wait, no. No. Stop writing the script past me. I just remember what happens here! So the eclipse begins and they enter the mansion. Serai shows up to help out, only reinforcing what I said about earlier, because, yeah, there's your third member. They kill a big plant, and it's time for the Dweller of Woe. Now, when I started the second playthrough, I had specific expectations. Basically, my opinion of this game would not improve. And it didn't, but what I wasn't expecting was that some of the bosses were better than I remember. Not all of them, mind, but more than I expected. In fact, I'll go out on a limb and say that the Dweller of Woe is the best boss in the game. So you can't fight with Garl because he's not capable of fighting Dwellers, except for when he can, with Moraine taking his place as well as Erlina and Pregame acting independently. So it definitely feels like a combined effort. Moraine doesn't have the same actions you do. He can choose to hold the rune, making the Dweller vulnerable, or fully heal your party, including revives. As I've stated before, Dwellers are vulnerable to Solstice magic, extremely vulnerable, so dealing damage and breaking locks is something you actually have to weigh the risks of. And thankfully, because of Moraine's healing, this isn't as risky as normal abilities. And because of the other two, damage will be dealt regardless. Furthermore, during the second phase, the mentors will get possessed and attack you, so if you paid attention to how they attack the Dweller, you could time a block on your first try. Do all these factors make for a difficult boss? No, it's easy as piss. But it wasn't much more enjoyable than the others, so I'm confident in saying it was the best. And in a game that unfortunately has a tendency to not have much variation between the bosses beyond lock patterns and attack animations, it was refreshing. Garl even gets a hero moment where he's asked to find a way to get more eclipse light into the battle. The trope of the unqualified guy helping out in a major way is always nice to see. Though, considering all he did was blow up the ceiling, you can't help but wonder why any of the others couldn't do this. But whatever, it's a nice moment for Garl. I'll try not to take it away from him. And just like that, the Dweller of Woe is defeated. Now, it's time for one of the worst plot twists I've ever seen. Before Pregame can destroy the Dweller's core, Serai stops him, and before anyone can process what's happening, Erlina walls her and the others off from them in the core, and that's when they appear. Oh shit, I didn't even mention them. So these four are the Fleshmancer's acolytes. We caught 2 glimpses of them at different points, and they're boring as fuck. I could not tell you a single thing about them outside of the fact they're an evil D&D party. None of them have personality outside of generic villain. There's no difference between them apart from their weapons, and this one doesn't even speak. Wait, shit, I meant this one. And their names are literally 1, 2, 3, and 4. Real creative genius on display here, folks. Also, yes, these are underlings and outright worshippers of the Fleshmancer. You know what? I'm already tired of that title. I'm just going to call him Aephorul. But these guys worship him, and the mentors have struck a deal with him. In exchange for their freedom, they will conjure a blood moon and resurrect the Dweller of Strife. Let's talk about why this twist is absolute inane horseshit. So everything starts with the decimation of the Solstice Order at the hands, I guess, of the Dweller of Strife. Moraine treats them much more harshly than before, and they're starting to feel a bit hopeless, and just kidding, none of this is important. No amount of justification for their motive will make this a good twist. Fundamentally, the mentors want to escape the burden of being a Solstice Warrior because everything is hopeless, blah blah blah. Now if I could ask, why in the mother of fuck would you sign off on resurrecting the very thing that made everything as hopeless as it is to accomplish this? This is like if someone killed your family and then to escape the monotony of your 9 to 5, you decide to give the sibling of that murderer the fucking nuclear codes. You two think it's perfectly acceptable to doom the entire world to destruction just because you think it's doomed anyway. Did you not for a second consider the fact that you are doing a big service to the guy responsible for putting countless worlds on the brink of destruction, creating the very creature that led to this situation, and whose doings have likely led to the destruction of more worlds than you could imagine? It's not like you were deceived by the acolytes. When Aephorul appears in the flesh, you just ask him to do what you wanted anyway. Oh, please let us escape from our responsibility as protectors. We just can't handle it. And while you're at it, erase our memories so we don't have to suffer the guilt of this unfathomable atrocity we've committed. And the icing on the cake is that even after all this bullshit to earn their so-called freedom, guess how it ends? They become servants. Servants! Both of them. Nice work. You really showed them, didn't you? Hope you enjoy all the freedom that comes with being subservient to dictators. Oh wait, that's not how it works. But thank God you don't have to save the world anymore, right? Go fuck yourself and die miserably, you actual irredeemable demons. I hate you. Needless to say, I didn't like this twist very much. The mentors were hardly characters to begin with, but this moment completely ruined them, which I suppose is impressive in its own right. But it's at this point where these two stopped being what were supposed to be characters and became plot devices masquerading as characters. I've stated before that believability is important in character writing, and I do not exaggerate when I say I couldn't imagine even the most despicable of human beings committing something even remotely comparable to this. If only because even that person would be smart enough to realize their actions are blatantly at odds with their interests. Not even Aephorul himself is this blatantly selfish. And this reveal is certainly not helped by the fact that none of the characters even attempt to break or get past the barrier before the animated cutscene plays. Even as the villains are monologuing about exactly what they're about to do, they just stand like NPCs, even though one of them can fucking teleport. Because that kind of bad direction never gets old. But this game that makes fun of other RPGs for supposedly overdone tropes will not be doing anything to subvert this.
Who I am? I don't give a fuck who you are!
The resurrection wrecks the port town and they were able to fend off the minions. And because this world is apparently filled with people who give up when things go even remotely wrong, a lot of the townsfolk want to start a new life elsewhere for some reason. They decide to settle on the uninhabited island to the north. And even though Serai could use a portal to transport all of them, this isn't up for debate. They decide the best way to get them there is to finally take control of the Vespertine. How they intend to do this without the coin? I don't know. Even after playing the game, I'm not 100% sure how it works. I guess they win over the ship's navigator and beat the captain to do it? I don't know. Also, this is when Serai reveals her identity to the others. They aren't at all surprised by this. You know, some things in your story are better off not being treated as jokes. They say a character is only as smart as their writer, but I guess that also applies to how seriously they treat the story. Time for everyone to settle on the new island. They start chopping trees down, or blowing them up, I guess. This happens off screen, by the way. I guess even with all the very niche actions this game chose to animate in extreme detail, they couldn't spare any effort to. During this process, the main duo are asked to investigate an ancient structure on the island, which turns out to be a fancy version of the backer credits. And then Garl is given the honors of naming this new town. Then Moraine shows up to deliver the bad news. We simply don't have the manpower to fight the Dweller of Strife, and it will be at full power again long before the next eclipse. You know, maybe taking your sweet time with killing them wasn't a good idea. The Dweller of Strife is hiding on Mesa Island, and the barrier won't be removed when the giant is still sleeping. How it got on that island when there's apparently no way to lower the barrier without waking the giant is anyone's guess. And then Moraine gives up. Bro, fuck the Solstice Order. These are some of the most nihilistic shitwits I've ever seen in a story. But he does tell you to go to Watcher Island and see the Oracle of Tides for some semblance of hope. Right now, I think it's worth mentioning that the pacing of the story is kinda ass. From the start of the game where you meet the Archivist, remember him, through the tutorials at the Academy to the beginning of the cavern takes about 40 minutes. Then to meet the Elder Mist and leave the first island, in other words, for the tutorialization to end, takes a little under 2 hours. And keep in mind, very little happens in terms of plot development. It was mostly gameplay. Gameplay that not only sucked, but gameplay you haven't finished learning about. And take into account that the main story takes about 20 hours, that means almost 10% of a standard playthrough is just the intro. And even then, it still takes longer for the plot to develop. Or how about the Crypt fetch quest that could have been removed? That took about an hour and 20 minutes. The worst of the pacing is definitely found in the second world, but we'll get to that. What certainly doesn't help the pacing is that the actual story being told is basically worthless, filled with tangents, contrivance, and plot holes alike, and something about it is just completely unengaging. But for now, speaking of pacing, I'm going to skip around a bit, because even though Moraine sent us to someone who could help, the Oracle of Tides does the same because he's just as clueless. What a useful character. He does give Garl a new prophecy, though. And after reaching the end of this tower, the door at the top won't open. We then cut to the Archivist talking about how no matter how many times this story plays out, the door never opens. But what happens if it does? The Archivist turns out to be more well known as the immortal alchemist, Resh'an. Aware of how powerful he is, they ask if he can just fix everything for them, but he can't due to a code. And breaking that would bring Aephorul's wrath on countless worlds. It turns out the two of them used to be friends. I'll have more to say about that later, but he will be able to help out just a bit, starting with sending them to a faraway mountain peak to collect a special artifact. Sure, I want to go on a tangent about the music, finally. The music overall is solid. A little hit or miss. Some of the songs I quite like. The exam dungeon has a nice ring to it. Garl's theme is nice. The most memorable are some of the battle themes. The main battle, for instance. Both versions of the boss theme are probably tied for my favorite in the game. The battle against Stormcaller. And Aephorul's boss theme just kicks ass. But plenty of the songs are just kind of forgettable. Not bad, just forgettable. And it's honestly hard to pin down why. I guess they just lack the oomph that you would expect from a better song. Though if there's any songs I'm not a fan of, it's the ones that originated from the Messenger. This game is a prequel, by the way, and it's actually quite easy to explain why I don't like them. Believe it or not, this actually ties into one of the few criticisms I have about the Messenger. For those who don't know, the Messenger has a thing where you're swapping between the past and future. The game represents this with either 8-bit or 16-bit graphics and music. Between the two, I prefer the 8-bit songs much more. As for why, I think it's because the songs feel like they were composed with 8-bit instruments in mind. Let me give you an example. Glacial Peak, easily my favorite song from The Messenger, but only the 8-bit version. So let's break it down. The beginning hits you like a truck, almost as shocking as how you got up here. The flute gives an appropriate sense of gravitas, and the background staticky instrument, I don't know what you call it, sounds just like the howling icy wind. Something I like about a number of the 8-bit songs in general is whenever they highlight a bass instrument, this being no exception. And the rest of the song manages to remain catchy while still keeping that sense of great peril. The 16-bit version doesn't quite have that same flair, and again, I think it's entirely down to the choice of instruments. It's not awful, just noticeably inferior. The instrument used in place of the flute especially is almost ugly. This happens for just about every 16-bit version. Even for tracks that you first hear are 16-bit. Glacial returns in Sea of Stars, and you be the judge. It just sounds slow. This goes for just about every returning song. The only one I'll give a pass to being Bamboo Creek, mostly because it's basically a new song. So after scaling the mountain, they find the artifact they were sent for, the Solstice Amulet, an item that allows the main duo to freely control the time of day. And I'll spare you guys of reiterating what I said about the implications of this ability now that the tablets aren't even a limiter. The party isn't done with Resh'an's errands though. Now they need to find a missing item of his, the key being the statue that Watcher Island is named after. He apparently knows that Aephorul is behind this because his pranks always involve giant statues? However, they will need to enter the sealed cave now that they can enter it with the amulet. Once in there, they will need to cleanse a dweller. Yep, there's an unknown dweller in this cave here, because every time someone exits the cave, they forget everything except the fear they felt, causing the entrance to be resealed. And Resh'an just gives them a magic solution to this problem, I guess. Wow. Holy contrivance, Batman. You know, I can't help but think that this would be better structured if you actually could enter the cave before getting the amulet. But when you try to do so, you immediately cut to the party exiting the cave, all mortified by what they saw, but not being able to remember it. Then, when they learn that this is happening because of the Dweller, now they have the necessary tools to slay it and stop the memory bullshit from happening. And therefore, you now have access to the cave. Man, isn't it crazy how the structure of the game and the writing of the plot would be improved if you had a bit more freedom? There are a lot of main story locations that you think you would be able to access before you can, but no. And oh boy, will I have more to say on this. The party kills the Dweller, find Resh'an's flask, and he decides to join them. But he'll be lowering his power level to stay covert. Off to Mesa Island, Resh'an gets the giant to remove the barrier in an overly drawn out and not funny scene, and they make their way to the Clock Castle. As I said, this is where it becomes apparent that this game is a prequel to The Messenger. Mesa Island is in fact what is known as the entire world in that game. Of course, people with some of the more obscure knowledge from The Messenger would figure this out just from the premise of Sea of Stars, and for the fact this was never kept a secret by the devs, but nothing of note happens aside from Resh'an receiving a prophecy from the Swamp Witch, and that Brugraves is following them. He and Erlina confront them when they make it to Clock Castle, and no shit, they think they can convince the main duo to see their point of view. This doesn't happen because why the fuck would it? And they enter. Also, I want to mention that even though you just got the ability to freely control the daytime, the game will still put broken runes on the ground in case you're too stupid to realize what to do. I must say, it's quite convenient that every place we sequentially go to requires an item that we conveniently found beforehand, almost as if this is one of those half-assed games that use these items to play at the idea of being non-linear despite having a very strict line of progression anyway. And this game that makes fun of other RPGs for supposedly overdone tropes will not be doing anything to subvert this. The Clock Castle, if I'm not mistaken, was designed by this person, a watchmaker, who also invented wheels. Oh shit, I didn't even mention wheels. So back when you meet the pirates, you're introduced to this minigame called Wheels, and act shocked, but it sucks. You start by selecting 2 figures, but you only start with 2 anyway. The game is like an auto-battler with the main gameplay being a mix of slots and Yahtzee. Every round you have 3 spins on your wheels, and every spin you can keep as many of the symbols you landed on as you want. Once all spins are used, combat plays out. There are 3 symbols: square, diamond, and hammer. You need to match 3 to do something, and matching an extra symbol will increase its effect by 1. Hammers build up a wall to block damage, while the other 2 advance your figure's actions and levels them up. It's much less complicated than I probably made it sound, but that doesn't make it good. The luck factor, for instance. No simple but addictive gameplay loop where the player's input is important. Just roll the dice and hope for the best. There's also only so many NPCs you can actually challenge. I think there's a grand total of like 8. And on top of that, there's the progression. I already mentioned how you start with 2 figurines and you'd be right to assume you unlock the other 4 through playing the minigame, but you also unlock new wheels, which affect, I guess, just one of your slots, and gives you better luck. But none of that matters, because the balance is also stupid. Every figure does different things, and every single battle is made trivial by combining the assassin and the cleric. The cleric doesn't attack, but instead heals you, up to 2 points past the usual maximum, by the way, and advances your second figure's action. The assassin attacks for low damage that goes past the wall and delays an enemy action. I swear to God, you can't lose with this team. The enemy wall doesn't matter because everything goes through it. Anything the enemy does doesn't matter because you can just stop them. What little damage they deal to you doesn't matter because you can heal. And not even the assassin's low damage matters because leveling up past max deals more unblockable damage. And I usually suck at making builds in these types of games, by the way. After making it to the castle, you meet a bunch of really old children. Yes, I'm being serious. You're going to help beat the Dweller of Strife by making a device to catalyze solstice magic. From there, they meet the Watchmaker, fight all 4 acolytes. Did I forget to mention you fight them before this? And now it's time for the Dweller. Like the Dweller of Woe, the battle against the Dweller of Strife was much better than I remember. You may have noticed I skipped over the Dweller of Torment. That's because there wasn't anything interesting beyond attack hands to stun him. The Dweller of Strife, on the other hand, is much more interesting. First off, Resh'an sits out this battle because it would violate his code. And more importantly, solstice magic in this fight is just as ineffective as any other attack. However, using said damage type will charge up the catalyst and deal major damage. Again, not an amazing fight by any means, and this means that this is basically a scripted fight, but still more interesting than most bosses. Once the fight progresses, however, the Dweller takes down the tower you fight on and puts the catalyst out of commission. Serai pleads to Resh'an to intervene, but he refuses, causing her to use his flask to damage the Dweller severely. This, of course, breaks the code, and Aephorul himself appears before the party, the mentors, and the acolytes. He isn't too pleased with this event, to say the least. And, credit for him pointing out how even though Resh'an didn't intervene, it was still his alchemy being used against the Dweller. And hey, Resh'an was already doing some indirect interfering anyway. Aephorul is pleased with the revival of the Dweller of Strife, and has a reward for the acolytes. He will fuse them together, which is this game's way of saying that the 5 of them become the Demon King and the Messenger. He also grants the mentors their heinously selfish request, and Pregame still thinks the main duo could see eye to eye. They don't, and he's never seen again. Until the messenger. Erlina is made into Aephorul's lieutenant, and now that everyone is gone, it's time for Aephorul to exact a fair punishment on Resh'an. He fires a blast at the main duo, but Garl blocks him. Resh'an stops time for a one-on-one talk, and when time resumes, Garl is mortally wounded. In the face of this grief, Zale fulfills his prophecy and carries Garl to the Eldermist, much to the astonishment of Aephorul and Resh'an, with Valir and the others soon to follow. Garl could not live the blow that Aephorul dealt, especially without having innate magic. But remembering the prophecy the Oracle of Tides gave him, he asks Resh'an for a flask of borrowed time. Garl still has a bit of time, but he must fulfill one last task. And after some brief flashes in his mind, he knows exactly what to do. Starting with this island here, it's time for Valir to fulfill her prophecy and create a path, which actually brings us to the last major change in the update. It's this animated cutscene. Anyway, after getting to the Sky Islands, Garl gets an audience with the Sky Giants Council. Garl's final request, give everyone else access to the Sea of Stars. The council won't grant access unless Garl can do something worthy of it. His plan? Soothe the sleeper. He will need to incorporate the elements to do it. So for wind, use Zephyr, which is found at these very islands. For fire, use the unnamed volcano. For water, use the scale from that sea serpent to grow a boatload of wheat. And for earth, the wind mage from the mole village will terraform the volcano. When all is said and done, they will have successfully made the biggest and tastiest loaf of bread the world has ever seen. The party split up to get everything they needed, with Resh'an making clones of himself to aid everyone. It's an arduous process, but everyone is able to do their part, and the sleeper is soothed. Also, Valtrade clearly isn't holding onto the weight and is just levitating it with his shoulders. I guess even with all the very niche actions this game chose to animate in extreme detail, they couldn't spare. Garl gives the sleeper the name Wentworth, and they go on one last flight to Moon Cradle with Garl shutting his eyes for good on the way there. Called it a cold take, but I think Garl is easily the best character. But the only real reason for that is because the rest of the cast is incredibly bland, and this is by far the biggest mistake of Sea of Stars. You may have noticed I've been referring to Zale and Valir as interchangeable, saying things like the main duo, and yes, it's because they're just that bland. Compared to the rest of the cast, despite the occasional writing flaws like what I mentioned at the start, Garl has a defined and consistent personality, compelling determination, and you can tell how much he cares about his friends just from the way he acts. I'll have more to say about the characters in general later, but Garl absolutely steals the show, and unfortunately, the game becomes much weaker and harder to get through without him. The time has come to sail the Sea of Stars and confront the Fleshmancer directly. After some trippy scenery, they arrive at a place that's unusually high-tech, and after fighting a big robot, we learn the actual truth about Serai. I don't think I've ever seen a reveal that's as unpredictable as it is expected. The fact that she's a cyborg is never hinted at or set up at all, except maybe for her portrait. But at the same time, even after revealing her obvious identity, it's made pretty explicit that she's still hiding something. But yeah, Serai left her world to find Solstice Warriors in the hopes that they will one day drive off Aephorul. And I guess she didn't have to go on a massive fetch quest to get to the Sea of Stars in her world. And I guess you don't need permissions from the Giants to enter their world. Unless she didn't use the Sea of Stars in the first place. I don't fucking know. Point is, her world is in dire straits. Everyone alive, almost, were turned into cyborgs. The sun is being blocked by a skybase constantly producing clouds, the moon sunk into the ocean, and a dweller is sitting comfortably next to it. The first course of action is to get to the skybase, but the transport system leading there has no power, so we need to find a way to do that, which involves going to this desert and finding your way to a point of interest. Why you have to try and navigate through a desert, and why nobody found this place when society is technologically advanced enough for weather-controlling skybases, I have no clue. But they make it to this strange dome filled with the souls of a now extinct race. That's when we meet this guy, whose name is... Oh, fuck off. Okay, this is a blatant nitpick, but as someone whose first language is English, I hate how so many of the names in this game are spelled. The amount of times I had to do a double or triple take on a name's pronunciation only to realize I had it wrong the whole time is maddening. And it even made writing the script hard. And every time I wrote Garl's name, Google Docs kept trying to autocorrect it to Girl. And then there's this name. How in the stinkiest of piss are you supposed to pronounce that? So anyway, Beast explains how his people built a failsafe on a separate island, and he can help get past the barrier blocking the entrance because, of course, there's one. Did I mention this game is linear as shit? However, much like the children in the Clock Castle, he will instantly perish if he leaves this dome. So there needs to be a way to preserve his soul. And this is when Resh'an realized that this is the key to Living Glass. After killing another big robot, he gets to work, and Best now has a body, now joining you as your sixth and last new party member. I kinda like him. For very superficial reasons, mind. Like the rest of the cast, there's no defining characteristics on display, and because you get him so late into the game, you don't get to give him those bonus level up stats, so I almost never used him in battle. But, you know, I like how he's animated at least. Boost then breaks the barrier to the Bird Island using a unique form of magic, to the astonishment of Resh'an. Bust is also about to explain something about the island's inhabitants to Resh'an, but is cut off by Valir, and they all just move on. Okay, what the fuck? I swear, this isn't the only time someone is abruptly cut off from conveying important information, but this is definitely the most egregious example. First, why did Valir do this in the first place? Anyone with the slightest hint of social competence would be able to tell that this is important information for Resh'an to know. Does she want this game to be over as much as I do? Second, why didn't Burst, or Resh'an for that matter, protest against this? Just to jump ahead a bit, these bird people are the reason Resh'an has his Great Eagle form. Because even with all the random magic he can pull out of his ass with his alchemy when the plot demands it, he apparently couldn't figure out how to fly. But seriously, why hide this? Boat should respond by saying, "Silence, wench, and let me explain this blatantly important info." Okay, not exactly like that, but you get the point. And you know what? Maybe I'm being unfair. After all, having enough of a spine to retaliate against this would mean having a character trait, and that just isn't allowed. Also, the plot of this island is just stupid. The party goes through, and the three stooges here notice. One of them goes to intercept them, he's successful, and sends them down a pit trap that they easily escape. Right. Then they find a prisoner who's stuck in a cage locked by a soundproof barrier, so a blast can't break it. Wait, what the fuck? If the barrier at the entrance of the island is strong enough that the party needed songster magic to break it, but there's a barrier on the inside that resists songster magic, why didn't you just put that at the entrance? You literal bird brains! So they break the prisoner out, he helps them, I don't care. I don't even remember what his name was for the purpose of the script. Daffy Duck here has apparently been watching them the whole time, and he didn't do anything to stop them even when he saw them break out a valuable prisoner. What? Who wrote this section? Did nobody at Sabotage think for a second that this plotline might have just a teaspoon of retardation within it? You guys are literally doing the Austin Powers thing without any sort of irony or parody to it. These are the kinds of cliches that we realized were bad decades ago, and you proudly displayed them here. But don't worry everyone, because this game that makes fun of other RPGs for supposedly overdone tropes will not be doing any. Of all the points in the game that I expected to hate more, this was not one of them. This whole section is just filled with lazy writing that's somehow worse than parody. But we get to the end and... Okay, look. There's confusing in the sense that the writing is so bad that you ask a million questions. and then there's confusing because you genuinely struggle to understand what's being conveyed. The cutscene that happens after the boss here is a big turning point for the story, but to this day, I still don't understand the implications of it. Resh'an learns that these bird people are the reason he has his great eagle form, because Aephorul sacrificed them to grant it to him. We get a flashback of when it was gifted, and upon learning that his evil doings began earlier than he thought, he just pieces out. Like, what the fuck? Am I missing something? Is there a crucial bit of information in one of Teeks' exposition dumps that I didn't bother reading through? This revelation apparently changes everything, but why? Like, we already know that Resh'an is researching different timelines, but we still don't know how or for what purpose. In fact, a good number of points of the story, like the concept of innate magic, are written in such a way that really feels like you're just expected to know obscure information or just instantly comprehend a new term or something. And that's just poor form. It's fine to relegate aspects of world building to the lore, but a story should still give enough info for the audience to understand, and unfamiliar terms should be either exposited naturally, mostly by explaining it to another character who lacks that information, or written so that the information about these concepts can be inferred. So Resh'an leaves behind a husk of himself and leaves to do whatever he did after this, if anything. And no, I don't think it was placing that device in the ruins, considering that was being foreshadowed before this part. And mark my fucking words, we'll get to that. They reactivate the transports, allowing them access to the skybase where they fight the Catalyst, the machine that robotified Serai's people. Unfortunately, the admin console is encrypted to the point that Serai's assistant, who I didn't mention before, can't even crack it. But then an AI core falls out of the machine, who apparently was being forced to operate a part of the Catalyst against its will, which... what the fuck? How does that work? Was the core already there? Did Aephorul's goons make it? If that's the case, why would you need to force it to do anything? And even if that's not the case, why would you have an uncooperative AI operate any part of a crucial machine like this? Whatever. It can't help because all I could do is offer schematics to the base itself, and that's when Teeks, who is just suddenly present for this particular scene by the way, decides it's time to finally be relevant to the story and use the grimoire to get a copy of the schematics. That's it, that's all she does in the story. The party needs someone who can actually break the encryption and decide to go to the old children for help. Yeah, okay. A computer assistant can't break it, but now that you have schematics that don't explain anything about the encryption itself, it means that a handful of kids with experience making clockwork-based machines will be able to crack a supercomputer that's many eras ahead in technological advancement. What the fuck? Now I must say, I've already spoken about the pacing of this game, but this, saga, I guess, is the only part of the game in terms of story and gameplay that feels straight up padded. For a small example, this puzzle where you have to activate this mining laser. Do you turn on this terminal to do it? No, because that moves this grapple tether, which you use to move it so you can grapple over to this spot and activate this terminal. And then you go back, move the tether again, and go to this point where you can use the terminal that just got enabled by the last one. And that turns on the laser. Now I'm no level designer, but this seems utterly redundant. The kind of thing a preteen would make on an extracurricular course on making video games that doesn't actually teach them anything. Why are you looking at me? And then there's this whole sequence. Now, knowing where the story is going, you should expect some kind of cut or fade to us getting to the Clock Castle, right? But no, first you exit the skybase and transport to the homeworld, then you go to the Clock Castle, and then you backtrack through Clock Castle, which means you spend half a minute holding up because it's literally a straight line to the room you're going to, because for some reason, the one location you backtrack through the most just so happens to be the one with no form of shortcut. You get an extended cutscene, it's only 5 minutes, but it feels much longer than that. Nothing of substance takes place. Bass talks to some people, Warren suggests he meet with the Elder Mist or something, and when everything's done, we discover that the kids have recreated the catalyst. Is it even worth mentioning that the AI core is mortified by what it did when it was part of the machine? I get that the kids have a good reason to use this tech, but this seems unusually sinister, not helped by the fact that this is never acknowledged. Everyone just forgets that an AI that was traumatized by being forced to roboticize people against their will got rescued from that machine and is now being used for the same purpose. Is it supposed to be different because the kids did it voluntarily? What am I supposed to think, game? So the kids reveal themselves as now being one being. Again, much more terrifying than the game's tone has you believe. After the exit, they rename themselves as the Artificer. The game takes well over a minute to explain this. Again, immaculate pacing. Of course, since the Artificer is a robot, they can exit the castle without dying, and it's time for them to hack the mainframe. And you guessed it, You have to manually go back to the skybase because this game is allergic to the idea of not wasting your time. At least this area has shortcuts. And since whoever wrote this is also allergic to the concept of critical thinking, or redrafts, 5 inventors who don't know anything about computers until just now are able to bypass an encryption that was so complex that an actual robot couldn't crack it. Like, what the fuck? Why was this the solution to this? Was it really nothing that Serai could have done? But whatever. Through the powers of robots, amalgamated children, nonsense writing, and nothing for the main characters to contribute, it works, and the clouds are gone. God, this game sucks. It's time for the fight against the Dweller of Dread, and the main duo are so far into their awakening that they do it without an eclipse. Not much to say about the fight itself, as it's nearly identical to the Dweller of Torment. Beating it unlocks the ability to fly in the overworld. Now that I have this, I decide to go and do all those shrines I couldn't get to before. It brings me to a refight against the Elder Mist, and winning grants me the main duo's best weapons. Along the way, I also find the purpose of those prisms underwater, and I have another refight, this time against a worm. I swear I've seen this somewhere else. And I get a new weapon for Resh'an? Okay. And after being sidetracked, I go to Aephorul's fortress, and it's time for the final confrontation. But before that, I want to rewind a bit, way back to when Garl was alive, because I want to talk about what I consider to be the best scene in the game. The moment time stops is that classic moment of a bad story having that one scene that feels like someone else wrote it. This scene accomplishes what virtually no other scene in the game did, and that was characterization. This scene succeeded in characterizing Resh'an, sure, but especially Aephorul. We begin with him impressed that Resh'an could stop time, despite how the two of them thought it was impossible, but Resh'an's research into time loops led him to an alternative to produce the same result. And after marveling at the time shards, which keep the loops stable, Aephorul speaks to Resh'an like a friend he hasn't seen in a while. This threw me for a loop and then some. Just through this single conversation, we learn so much about these two and their connection. We see that Resh'an actually feels guilt over some of the things he's done, and we also get to understand his faith that the main duo will defeat Aephorul. And him? He doesn't talk like someone who believes he's in the right by taking over the planet and committing genocide, but as someone who couldn't care if he's in the wrong. And if there's one line that sticks in my head, it's when Aephorul says, "You always were the better artist." That line alone paints such a clear picture of what he thinks of Resh'an and why he even does what he does. And pair that up with the one flashback you get later, and you get a clear picture of why these two were such close friends. These two desired little more than to surpass their limits and do the impossible. But that quest made one of them go on a dark path. It is really jarring that such a scene was placed in the midst of a story that is struggling to be engaging, and delivers solid characterization where the overwhelming majority of characters are flatter than the paper they were conceptualized on. The time-starved conversation is by far my favorite scene in the game, and is downright great in isolation. So, why am I explaining this now? Because the endgame ruins it. After getting flight and access to Aephorul's fortress, the party make their way through. Is it worth mentioning how this flight can apparently carry the entire Vespertine? Anyway, there's not much here that's worth talking about. There's a boss at the beginning who is apparently important enough to have his own portrait, even though we just met him and he dies right after. There's also that dumb thing where the pace of the dungeon is completely disrupted by the party getting stuck in a fake dream world only to solve it because they're special, I guess. And then they beat the Soul Curator. I didn't mention him before, he's the one who is directing the catalyst to robotify Serai's people. And then there's this weird moment where Serai wants to destroy this portal that's sending Aephorul's minions throughout the universe. Their efforts to damage it are unsuccessful, as it apparently is so reactive to solstice magic that it'll basically become a nuke. And ignoring any possible questions of whether or not dwellers could be made of such a material, we established that the portal will need fast and precise attacks to destroy. So obviously that bird we rescued, remember him? No, you don't. Even if you played this game, you don't. He's the one who breaks the portal, and why? Is there really no way for the main party to do this? Zale's whole thing, I think, is being fast, and Serai is literally an assassin. She has precision down, unless I don't know how fucking assassins work. Maybe someone else could pitch in? Maybe this moment grants a new combo ability? But no. This beyond forgettable NPC does something in place of the main characters, which, what the fuck? Why is this the solution? Are you guys afraid of giving your characters agency? Do you think if you do so, then they'll gain sentience and kill you through your computer monitor? If I didn't know any better, I would say this guy is actually a scrap party member. Probably cut because I guess even with all the very niche actions, this game chose to animate in extreme detail. Oh, and to reinforce what I said about this arc of the game being padded, here's some uncut footage. Do I have to explain what's wrong with that? No? Good. Moving on to the final boss. So about what I said regarding the endgame ruining my favorite scene, this is where it starts. Aephorul's motive and interesting dynamic with Resh'an is thrown out the window in favor of a generic, evil, edgy bad guy with a god complex. When the party challenges him, he responds by saying, "Fighting Solstice warriors is beneath me." Even though he should know at this point, the main duo have near completed ascension, so they're definitely more than just Solstice warriors. And upon hearing this rejection of their challenge, how does the party respond? Do you see what I mean about these characters having no character? So, they just stand there like bobbleheads and let them monologue. Again, I guess the game that makes fun of other RPGs for supposedly overdone. And then he calls out his new lieutenant, Erlina, now going by the name of... What the... Fuck off! Who keeps coming up with these names? Oh, the studio's based in Quebec. I should have known the French were responsible. So Lieutenant Erlina comes forth. I refuse to pronounce that name, let alone write it in my script more than 0 times. The main duo tries talking to her, but it doesn't work because that's how memory wiping works, and it's battle time. I think it's here that I really have to emphasize what I said earlier about these bosses having little in the way of interesting mechanics, and only being differentiated by locks and attack animations. Because for a final boss, there isn't anything noteworthy about this first phase. There's nothing in terms of any kind of mechanical depth. Just do the same thing you do all the time anyway. Spam basic attacks to replenish, and then spend your resources to break lock patterns and trivialize the game. If you're like me, you'll have even upgraded max MP so much that you can spam Lunar Shield because it's insanely OP for something you get early on. So you beat her, and it's second phase time. Her ultimate form is... a floating head and hands. What is this? A platformer. The second phase has more to it though. She has an AoE that life steals, and she also traps the party member in this cage, and if you don't break its lock pattern, it will insta-kill the trapped character. And that's about it. Like I said, there's nothing to this gameplay loop outside of building resources to stop this from happening in the first place. The prisons require little more than a boosted basic attack to break on top of that, and to make matters worse, this phase is long. It took me about 14 minutes to beat, and with how repetitive the combat in this game is, you feel every minute. And again, you have so many means of trivializing the game by this point that nothing poses a meaningful challenge. So you beat her, and then Aephorul finishes her off. Wow, thanks. I'm glad I got even mildly invested in him. Man, the villain who's so evil he kills his subordinates when they do something he doesn't like? Never seen that before. Turns out this game that makes fun of other Resh'an, the real Resh'an, walks in and says to Aephorul, "Give up already, you bitch," and he leaves. Not before saying something ominous to the main duo. That's when they sense a World Eater. Resh'an wishes them luck and leaves. Serai and Belch rejoice that their world is saved, and before the main duo set off to fight the World Eater, Teak shows up, I guess, to record their story in her grimoire. Remember what I said about Teaks and the fabric being important for one scene before the very end? There you go. I guess there's one more boss before the end, and it's just the main duo, Solon and Luana, fighting the World Eater. I'm very interested in what this battle will look like. Wait, what? Well, that might have been the most anticlimactic final boss I've seen in an RPG. Maybe even video games in general. After like 20 hours of playing through this slog of a story, we end up with a fight that isn't interesting to play in the first phase, and then a second phase with lame visual design and slightly more interesting to play that really overstayed its welcome. And after that, the traitorous mentor, which serves as even a thin driving force for the main duo to make it here in the first place, is abruptly killed off without the main duo even getting a word of reaction. And the guy who was built up from the beginning as the ultimate villain just pieces out after he lost a bet. I wish I could simplify this in a way that didn't sound reductive, but that's what it ultimately comes down to. And then to rub salt in the wound, you don't even get a real fight against the World Eater, just an easy as piss shoot 'em up. A gameplay style that doesn't show up at any other point before this, by the way. Even Sonic Frontiers got this right. And then the credits roll where you get a quick montage of what happens to that not-so-lovable cast of characters. Yeah, I don't care. I'll just skip through this so that I can talk about... how long are these backer credits? And then the last scene is decades into the future where we see Teeks, now the Elder of Mirth, regaling children with the story of the now guardian gods, so that they may now know how not to write an RPG story. And then we see that she, as well as the Artificer, have been working on a shrine in the Crypt because there can't just be one thing from the messenger that's left unexplained. The end. But obviously, it's not over. You've played video games before, you know what's happening. It's time to get the true ending. Now, I have to come clean. Remember what I said after unlocking Flight? About my little side tangent? I lied. I actually didn't do that. During this playthrough. I did do those side quests on my first playthrough, but not this one. The concerningly astute among you may have even noticed that the color of my weapons didn't match the one I would have unlocked. I skipped these missions mainly to confirm a suspicion, and that suspicion was true. Meaning we now get to one of my biggest issues with the game, and one that I briefly touched on earlier. Sea of Stars is way too linear. There's nothing in the game that you can do simply for the sake of doing it, or to get special items, or to get more story. Nowhere is this more egregious than with story progress. Every single area you can go to is blocked off unless the game lets you go there. And not blocked in an interesting way like, I don't know, requiring a traversal item, or needing some other key item you get elsewhere, like what they do at other points in the game. You just go to a location, you aren't allowed in, and you just wait until the game lets you. Even after getting the ship, allowing you to go to whatever island you wish, there are just arbitrary roadblocks that require a specific cutscene to get past. And then there's the quote-unquote side quests that you can do. Now these aren't side quests in the traditional sense, because they aren't what you would call optional. Every single one is needed to get the true ending. And even items that would traditionally be used as side quest rewards in a better RPG are strewn about in the world as random chests that look the same as the ones that give you random junk. Now let's actually talk about the side quests needed for the true ending. First, there's the two I mentioned before. I did those of my own volition because I already had a taste of the shrines earlier, and every cleared one would play this cutscene, making me want to know what would happen or what I would get for clearing all of them. The war refight I did because there's structures that stick out like a sore thumb, and I wanted to see what they did. The fact I got the best weapons for select characters was rewarding enough on its own. And knowing I had to do these just to fully experience the story actually makes them feel less rewarding. Then there's the Duke's Quest. Again, something that could be done without prompting. However, it's just another refight and the reward is so insignificant I literally forgot what it was. Last side quest is much more obscure because you have to return to the port town after a certain point, even though you don't really have a reason to. This one I only would have done had I known I needed to, but there's reward enough with 3 new bosses, even though 2 of them aren't memorable gameplay wise, and new equipment. And overall, is admittedly one of the better quests, even from a story perspective. Serai's quest? Not so much. First, I refuse to believe that anyone discovered this on their own, considering how it's initiated. The story involves Serai just casually mentioning a sudden major threat to her people that was never mentioned before. You go to Teeks to learn of an expedition team that search for it, you write down the correct desert navigation, fight a new boss, and that's it. Unlike Balls' quest where I wouldn't have done this without knowing its necessity, Serai's quest I never would have done without knowing its necessity. You started by talking to her at a rest site after a certain point. And, I might have had reason to do that if the characters were interesting enough to talk to, but the last thing you need for the ending isn't actually a quest, it's a quota. Throughout the game you can find these chests that contain a collectible called a Rainbow Conch. You cash these into the vendor at the underwater village to get miscellaneous rewards, mostly consisting of blueprints to build new facilities in Mirth. And no, I'm not going to waste time talking about that. I mean, face it, you probably forgot about it by now anyway. The buildings themselves aren't all that interesting, but one of these conch rewards are needed for the true ending. And this one requires all 60 of them. Because after everything we had to do to get to the true ending, what we really needed was a dumbass, boring-ass, frustrating-ass scavenger hunt. Not only is one of them hidden in a corner of the port town that's really obscure and almost impossible to locate in the restored version of the town, I swear, I wasted at least 20 minutes trying to find this on my first playthrough, purely because the guide I was forced to find was useless. but some of them are obtained through random NPCs that you have no reason to talk to, completely breaking the consistency of them being found in chests, and further cementing this game's crippling linearity. Again, these are the kinds of things that would give you something more substantial in a better game, but those rewards have been relegated to normal-ass chests. But moreover, why must I jump through these hoops just to get the true ending? Have the devs not heard anyone anywhere complain about similar things in other games? Do you think it's different because your game only has 60 of them? Or is it because the ending itself is so good that experiencing it justifies going through all the stuff needed to see it in the first place? Well, Mr. Machete from 5 seconds ago, I have some bad news. The true ending sucks. And it all starts here. Doing all those quests, for some reason, activates this device that showed up after beating the game. Bollocks recognizes it as the chronophage, something that Resh'an told him about before. And after presenting it with Garl's cookie jar from the beginning of the game, it opens a portal that he, Zale, and Valir enter. This brings them to a familiar place, or rather, a familiar time. This is apparently Resh'an's final gift to the main duo. Using this opportunity, they will take Garl's body away, and Bees will take his place since he actually can survive Aephorul's blast. And so, while Aephorul is still looking away, Garl is replaced and brought back to the present alive and well. From here, they share a reunion and go get Bart, who is now lying in Garl's grave. So, there is a lot wrong with this plot point, and I will get to that. But first, remember what I said about the battle system? How it kind of feels like the devs just slapped in mechanics that people like from other games without consideration of how it will affect the game as a whole? Well, this part of the game is like the story version of that. It was clearly put in as nostalgia bait, thinly veiled as paying homage. Now, I actually never played Chrono Trigger before, and there's a reason I did it for the sake of this video. My take on Sea of Stars is far from unique. In fact, there's another video I've seen a while back, which is a good one by the way, I'll be sure to link it, but watching that taught me something important about the inspirations of Sea of Stars. For those who don't know, well, first, this is possibly the biggest spoiler for Chrono Trigger, so you've been warned. So, Chrono, the main character, dies. When face to face with the main threat, Lavos, he heroically puts his own life at risk to save everyone. Sounding familiar yet? The rest of the party go to the old man at the end of time for something, anything that could bring him back. And that's when they're given this egg called the Chrono Trigger. And after getting the Chrono Doll from his house, which can be obtained from as early as the beginning of the game by the way, they climb up a mountain in the far future, and after reaching the summit, the Chrono Trigger activates, bringing the party to the moment before Chrono's death, where they use the doll to replace him, saving his life. If you couldn't tell already, this was copied pretty much beat for beat in Sea of Stars, but not as good. The party and Chrono Trigger are actually working towards this, even though it's not guaranteed. And 2, Chrono's revival actually makes sense mechanically. You see, both games work on the same time travel rules. Changing the past changes the present. This is indisputable. But only one game actually understands the implications of such a rule. It's easy to forget, but Garl doesn't actually die here. He dies much later, after being given more time to survive in order to do all that stuff to open the Sea of Stars. Which, considering that nothing about the present actually changed except for Bulks being in Garl's grave, would mean that he did everything Garl did in the exact same way to produce almost the same outcome. And this introduces many problems. One question this raises is, what exactly are the prophecies worth now? Did they account for this? Are they just wrong now? Did none of the more omnipotent characters notice that Garl wasn't Garl? And if they did, would that not drastically change the course of history? Or did Resh'an just tell everyone to play along? And you know what? I'm not entirely convinced Brat can actually copy a normal person. What, considering the game never tries to convince me otherwise? Like, look at this. That is clearly not an identical copy. How is it possible to copy a human if your ass is a mass of glass and gas?
But I'm not done yet!
This event also raises a trillion questions about the afterlife. When Garl is brought back to the present, he doesn't behave like the Garl we took from that frozen point in time. Rather, he just has the memories of a Garl who died normally, then watched the rest of the game up until this point. Did his afterlife memories get implanted into him as soon as he reached the present? Does the afterlife exist outside of time and space or something? Why can't he talk about what he saw on the other side? What exactly does it mean to die in this world? And above all else, why does being resurrected through means that would realistically break the series of events as we know them mean you can have a wish granted? None of this makes any sense! You guys do realize that Chrono Trigger avoids these questions not only because there is a case of the old Chekhov's gun with the doll you get at the fair, but also, Chrono got evaporated by Lavos. There was no grand quest on his deathbed that the doll had to do. Hell, his influence on the world effectively ends here. To make matters worse, Garl's resurrection isn't easily fixed by just replacing him on his ride back to Mooncradle, because he is literally on borrowed time. If they took that Garl to the present, he would die right after. Or would the afterlife gods just hand-wave it and let him live anyway? These are the kinds of questions that an audience should never have to ask about your story. You never have to ask this about Chrono Trigger because it is straightforward, easy to follow, and consistent within its own rules. Also, for fuck's sake, thanks for attaching this dogshit plot point to my favorite scene in the game. Wait, how did Aephorul not see this happen? He wasn't distracted for long. In fact, after these three enter this frozen point, he is distracted for a grand total of 1 dialogue box. How does this make sense? Whatever, I could go on, but you get the point. The revival of Garl is horrendously executed. Moving on. The party has a dinner scene that really just goes to show how little character these alleged characters have. They just talk how they usually do, even though this is a pretty big moment. In fact, I don't even think Serai even talks at all after getting changed. Probably because she has nothing of substance to add to the scene, or perhaps more likely the devs didn't give her a new dialogue portrait for this scene like the rest of the characters. Because even with all the very niche actions Also, I have to point out how funny it is that Garl raises a toast to Moraine for, quote, standing firm in the face of insurmountable grief and never wavering in his faith in my friends. Like, did you guys even write your own game? So after that dinner scene, it's time for the true final battle, and you know what that means. Sorry I have to make this video worse just to emphasize a point, but what else could I possibly say? The footage speaks for itself. Now I know what you're thinking. Probably. What exactly about this encounter will change now that Garl is alive? Nothing else has changed. Nobody has memory of the last battle against Demon Arlena, and even after a quick chat with Resh'an at the end, we still don't know what he was doing. What will having Garl on the team do? Well... That's right, the only reason we didn't fight Aephorul at first is because nobody besides Garl has enough agency to say fucking anything when he refused to fight us himself. Kinda hilarious when you think about it. And hey, what more proof do you need to show that Garl's the best character in the game? He's the only one with a fucking spine. But now that Aephorul is thoroughly pissed off, he fights us himself. Unfortunately for the player, this isn't an interesting fight. There's a bit of depth to it. He'll spawn these buds of flesh, and if the following lock set isn't broken, he becomes invincible until these... things are defeated. But that's about it. It's here I finally realized that any attempt a boss can have at being mechanically interesting is undermined by the lock system, because the only interesting stuff they ever do is tied to it, and you can just stop that from happening by breaking a lock set. Maybe this is why they added the hidden locks, so that the bosses actually have even a single chance to use them without being interrupted. Unfortunately for Aephorul, even that can't save him now that Garl is on your team. Or rather, his ultimate specifically, because its damage type is all of them. So add that to the list of things that trivialize the game. Also, halfway into the fight, it suddenly goes into the Toho mode. And it's not like this adds anything to the fight itself, it's just thrown in for some reason. Like, seriously, look at this cut. It's like the game just forgets that it happened. Anyway, after fighting him for half a fucking hour, he's defeated. Aephorul, for some reason, is in disbelief that he got beat by a cook, a cyborg, a theoretically immortal golem, a clone of his equal, and 2 goddamn gods. Man, I love it when villains have toddler IQ. Garl beats him over the head and Resh'an takes him away again. From here, it basically plays out the same as the fake ending, where the main duo say their goodbyes before Wait, the same? No. Surely there must be something different. You can't just have the true ending play out like that. Oh, for fuck's sake. Well, that might have been the most anticlimactic true final boss I've seen in an RPG, maybe even video games in general. After all the garbage you're forced to do to unlock this, your reward is a revival that breaks space-time, a meaningless dinner scene, and a final boss that doesn't even have the decency to have a second phase, or at least a good one. And also, what the fuck? Are you telling me that the fake ending has you settle your score with Erlina but leaves Aephorul as a loose end? But then the true ending does the opposite? This ending isn't any better than the other. Even the end credits montage only has half the scenes actually changed. And when all is said and done, it ends basically the same way, except Garl is alive. And he also helps with that stupid goddamn shrine. God, just make it end already. The fact this won Indie Game of the Year at the Game Awards is nothing short of depressing. I mean, I get that audiences continue to find reasons not to care about the awards themselves, but developers both big and small consider these legitimate accolades. And if Sabotage thinks that this is indicative of the actual quality of the product, then what do you think their thought process is going to be for making games moving forward? Needless to say, I'm not expecting much. As of writing this, there is a major update that has yet to be released. This update includes new areas, story, skill for the main duo, and an all-new party member. And so far, nothing I've seen about it has me convinced it will be any better than the base game. All in all, this game is an immeasurable disappointment. I know better than to expect more from a game than it deserves, but never until now did I know what it's actually like to set your expectations too high. It would have been fine, perfectly serviceable even, if it didn't trip over itself at almost every step. So let's go over said steps. The presentation, while easily the best part about the game, is unfortunately quite inconsistent, if not questionable. I get the impression that if I actually learned how much it took to animate Maureen ripping his sleeves off, I would be stunned. And not in a good way. There's a reason I've been making it a running gag. They put all this effort into these short animations that you only see once. And none of that effort goes into things you see multiple times, like the combo attacks. They seem to have a misguided belief that they need to animate everything at 24 frames or it wouldn't look good, instead of allocating that effort to things that actually need it. Or putting better, not more, detail into the frames. The point of this video isn't supposed to compare this game to Chrono Trigger, but just look at these victory animations. Which game has 10 times as many frames to serve the same purpose? Now, which game does a better job at displaying the character's personality? And this even leads to cases like what's-his-name levitating wheat bundles on his shoulders. There are some other aspects of the presentation I neglected to mention, specifically with the cutscenes. No, not those ones. The normal ones. Take a closer look at them. Notice how the characters rarely, if ever, emote in any way. There's no emotions, sense of direction, only a unique pose on a scant few characters, not even so much as a question mark / exclamation point bubble. Any possible emotions displayed by the characters will be displayed in their text portraits, and honestly, that might actually work against itself. Even though there are seamless transitions between the gameplay and cutscene, the lack of effort that goes into the direction of the cutscenes means they may as well be black screens with text boxes and portraits. You're genuinely not missing out on anything otherwise. But onto the gameplay. It ranges from unremarkable, especially in exploration and puzzle solving, to flat out unfun. The combat is quite simply a mess. A mess of mechanics that don't lend themselves to each other, a mess of balancing, a mess of difficulty. It really just feels like a mix of ideas that worked in other games slapped together and barely held together by their own ideas in a misguided attempt to keep it fresh. If you kept everything about this game the same, but removed the lock system, you would have a much better game on your hands. The devs didn't realize this though because they decided to double down by somehow making the lock system worse. But even with that removed, we still have issues, especially with balancing. This isn't just a concern for competitive games. Basically, every game has to deal with balancing. And in Sea of Stars, a lot of the skills you get access are way too overpowered for how early you get some of them. And then some of them are just worthless. For example, just looking at Valyr's kit. What's the point of Crescent Arc? There's basically no point where you need to hit multiple enemies with blunt damage. And if it's for moon damage, you could just use moon rank to hit every enemy for potentially more damage if you're good enough. And if it's for both damage types, you could just use a boosted basic attack for an extra hit of blunt damage. And then there's the shield, a move so overpowered that the only way Aephorul avoided being trivialized by it was by just ignoring its damage nullification. And that's to say nothing of any other overpowered BS that other characters like Resh'an have. And despite their attempts to remedy this, the difficulty design as a whole leaves a lot to be desired. The relics are a bad idea executed badly, and the difficulty select doesn't help because it's working within that system. Of course, you get all the bullshit, unfair nonsense that appears in the first parts of the game, and then you unlock more characters and abilities, making the game so easy, it's boring. Well, more boring than it already was, I guess. And while I do think that the combat and balancing being fixed would make the game at least passable, and the presentation is still good barring a few missteps and unremarkable songs, those issues are ultimately small potatoes compared to the problems with the writing, and you can't fix that with a medium-sized patch. And for a story-based RPG to have such weak writing is inexcusable. People play games to have fun playing them, yes, but RPGs, especially JRPGs, are loved for the story and characters. The story of Sea of Stars? Well, ignoring the presentation-related issues I mentioned, the story as a whole suffers from shoddy pacing, overly linear structure with unnecessary padding, poorly explained world building, and, well, just bad writing in general. It's almost comical how, in the opening flashback, which overstated its welcome as is, spent all this time talking about the magic fabric when it has no noticeable importance to the story or gameplay. And then anything with more significance, from the origins of the Sleeper to how the Acolytes survived for how many years, is relegated to optional lore dumps. And I don't know where else I can mention this, but in regards to the padding, if you want to challenge the Watchmaker at Wheels, you need to go all the way through Clock Castle to get to her with no shortcuts. Twice, which means if you want to get the flimsy hammer from her, you need to take this trip to her 4 times if you count the trips back. So just imagine this 4 times. And this isn't mentioning any number of times you have to do it again because you don't have the money for the table, or you didn't realize you couldn't challenge her. Like me. And the writing mistakes can range from anywhere from overestimating their own skill, like the case with Garl's revival, or stuff like what's on Bird's Island, the kind of mistakes you make on your first creative writing test. The fact the events of that island are on par with parody despite how it's meant to be taken seriously is just sad. Also, what exactly is this game's sense of time? We have enough of a civilization for there to be port towns, but we never get to know if the world's any bigger than the small archipelago we play on. Also, there's islands that haven't been named yet, even if they're perfect for settling. We have islands that are named after dwellers, making you wonder how long they've been left at large. I have never had to ask how old a world is before, but first time for everything, I guess. And I could go on. I could talk about all the questions raised by the world building. I could talk about how the events rarely feel like they connect naturally. But the biggest flaw with the writing is definitely the characters. There's only scraps to chew on with them. The overwhelming majority of the cast lack anything in the way of dimensionality, defined characteristics, or just anything that would make them the slightest bit compelling. And what's worse is how static these characters are. This doesn't inherently have to make the characters less compelling or the story less interesting, but as I alluded to way back, how characters develop or stay the same is a big part when it comes to believability. However, generalizing them can only do so much, so let's go over them one by one. I should talk about the Acolytes first. Not because they're the worst characters, but because if I wait any longer, I might actually forget to write a section on them. In fact, the game's writers themselves may have forgotten a thing or two about them. Not that I would blame them, though. Well, actually, if I just showed you their character portrait, I guarantee you couldn't tell me which one it belonged to if you tried. The fact these are teased as a big foil to the heroes near the beginning is just worthless. They never act as a threat to the party, and even in the 2 instances where they actually are active, they're a complete joke. They're just faceless entities to facilitate the Mentor's betrayal and to serve as an origin for the Demon King and the Messenger. Because we really fucking needed that. And to be clear, I consider myself to be quite the world-building enthusiast. I can appreciate when something gets explained in depth, or when strange beings, phenomena, or magic systems are given origins. When it's done well, having the knowledge that the Demon King is made of these 4 bozos makes him much less interesting. And as a final point against the Floptastic 4, you can't even treat them as a big threat when Aephorul being the ultimate villain is explained earlier than the combat tutorials. They're just so boring. The only thing I can remember about them is how 1, 3, 5, whatever his name is, always talks in the exact same pattern. Unfortunately for the writers, a speech pattern is not personality, nor is it a replacement for it. Speaking of which, the pirates. Collectively, probably the most irritating characters in the game, because despite being one-dimensional caricatures, they're treated like these incredibly important, lovable, quirky comic relief tools. And there would be something to appreciate about characters that only exist as one-note comic relief tools if they were, funny. I've already spoken about the infuriating and hypocritical meta-humor from Yolande, but the other 2 don't do anything interesting either, and they never try to shake things up with them either. It's always the same, so it's immediately repetitive. And they could have made up for their bad jokes if they were actually good characters, but just like 20, all they get is a speech pattern. And to top everything off, their actual utility in the plot is more insignificant than that charity donation you made at the supermarket yesterday. The rest of the supporting cast barely fare much better. Remember Malcolmud? No, you don't. I didn't even mention him by name yet. An absolute brat of a character who's so irresponsible that he would risk, unknowingly or not, the entire world being destroyed by the Sleeper because the other villages aren't nice to him. In fact, when confronted with the fact that clogging the wind tunnels would wake the Sleeper, he's shocked by this? But how? Even people outside the Mole Village know the purpose of the wind tunnels. So even if he's young, how could he, a native of the very village that the tunnels are made under, not know that? And all is forgiven without even an inch of discipline. Call it a cool and engaging character art all you want, but personally, I hate the guy. Being ridiculed by your peers is not a justification for this level of irresponsibility. Actually, it's not a justification for irresponsibility, period. And despite him only having this moment with the heroes, they warm up to him enough that they chose him to terraform the volcano for the giant bread. Hell, they even bring him to the dinner scene. Like, damn, had no idea that 2 interactions made him that important to you. Who else? Yes, Teeks, the character I could best describe as disposable. Putting aside the insane implications of her grimoire, she just kind of exists. Take away the character behind the important item and just give it to the existing cast, and nothing about the story actually changes. There isn't much to be said about her. Like, she gets giddy when it comes to recording history, but outside of one instance late in the story, she just sits in your cargo waiting for you to care enough about this game to sit through lore dumps. And unfortunately for her, I don't have the patience to learn about a world I'm not invested in. Even the end, where she tells the hero's story to the children, could have been done by anyone. Imagine how differently this scene would have hit if someone we don't recognize tells your story using her grimoire. Giving you an idea of how much time passed. Which is a good segue into me talking about the old children. Or the artificer, rather. You really have to wonder how time works in the Clock Castle if children can't grow up but still get wrinkles like old people. But ignoring time mechanics, those are broken enough as is, we have a similar case with the Acolytes, where each of them are so ill-defined that it's impossible to list a difference between them. Even the game only considered one of them important enough to give a portrait. And even when they become the Artificer, they just become a one-dimensional giga-genius that can hack past firewalls on a device that is eras past anything they've ever seen in their life, let alone made. Also, that whole plotline of them becoming the Artificer, am I the only one who found it unusually disturbing? The first thing they do when trying to figure something out about the Catalyst is to take the AI that was used against its will, however that works, and is regretful of being used to turn humans into cyborgs, and uses it to turn themselves into a cyborg. Not just that, but permanently fuse their minds together. Seriously, change the visuals and this becomes the plot of a horror game. The fact that this game treats it as a triumphant moment almost feels inappropriate. And all this was so they could escape the castle and do something they shouldn't realistically be able to do to begin with. On a related note, I'd like to give an honorable mention to the bird prisoner I can't remember the name of. Perfectly emblematic of this game's weird tendency to create a problem for the heroes to solve, and instead of having the characters we follow overcome these challenges themselves, they just throw in, or in some cases, literally invent a character that has a skill set that can solve the problem better than the heroes ever could. Birdface's existence is the only thing in the game that gives me a solid impression there was significant cut content. It really does feel like he was meant to be a party member. Not like that would automatically make him a better character or anything, you still have to competently write him. Next, I want to talk about the Solstice Order, Moraine, Erlina, and Brugaves. The story has gone out of its way to show that the people with the responsibility of protecting the world from its greatest existential threat are impossibly incompetent. They'll have complete knowledge of where a dweller is, but not give a shit about them until they feel like it. Even though an eclipse isn't a bi-yearly occurrence, they don't care, and will just hold off on killing them as fast as possible while they gather more power, to the point where islands are named or renamed after them. We also learned that this order is very effective at breeding the most selfish and nihilistic heroes to ever be put to fiction. I've said my piece in regards to the mentors, but Moraine still deserves attention. Credit where it's due, at least he didn't give up as fast as the others, but we never get to confront him after he does. Keep in mind, giving up was the entire reason Erlina and Brugaves turned traitor. And even right after this happens, nobody present in the scene calls him out on this. He just gives us a hammer, and all is forgiven. Though I guess I shouldn't expect much from the main characters if they're as flat as the rest. And I suppose that means it's time to talk about them. Let's start off easy. Garl. I've said he's the best character in the game for a reason. As an example, while not a hard rule, an effective litmus test for well-written characters is, can you imagine what they would do outside their own story? Needless to say, Garl is the only one I can answer with yes. Compared to everyone else, he has a personality that's consistent, a clear motive, and a level of dimensionality. His optimism and thirst for adventure is almost charming. He has some of the best moments in the game, ones that are consistent with his character, and ones where he also gets to shine with his unique skills. There's a reason his presence was needed to challenge Aephorul. The others were so wooden that they didn't even react to him denying their challenge. If Garl were suddenly plopped into our world, I can imagine what he would do. Maybe he would open a restaurant, or more likely a food truck. Maybe take up LARPing as a hobby. Now, all that being said, Garl still suffers from the ever-present bad writing. I already spoke about the issues with his lack of believable development at the start, but despite being the most dimensional character, he's far from being three-dimensional. And if someone were to argue to me that he's a Gary Stu, I would know which particular moments they would refer to. He's still the best character, but he's not great. Just okay. Now let's put the rest of the heroes on the side burner for a second. Now I want to talk about the biggest letdown of the main cast. Aephorul. For a final villain that makes extraordinary creatures and is presumably responsible for the destruction of many worlds, he is pathetic. Generic and boring god complex aside, something I realized while writing this is that we never actually get a clear picture of how powerful and threatening he actually is. He makes world-destroying monsters that can only be destroyed by a specific and rare set of people, sure, but as an entity himself, he shoots lasers and makes a lot of mouths. Is this a fetish or something? What certainly doesn't help is that there were the seeds of an interesting villain. The way he talks to Resh'an and how the relationship changed into what it is by far the most interesting thing about him, and it's dropped as fast as it's developed. This isn't to say that good villains need nuanced motives, let alone agreeable ones, or even be the slightest bit sympathetic. If Aephorul was a compelling threat to the heroes and the player, that would have been enough. As a character, however, he would have benefited greatly from this kind of development, but as it stands, he sucks. The immortal mage with powers on par of that of gods is so lazy that his minions do all the heavy lifting for him, and when it's time to take matters into his own hands and protect his rule over an entire world, he gets taunted and bitch-slapped by a fat kid with a lid.
How embarrassing.
Back to the heroes, and who better to go to than Resh'an? I think he's easily the most confusing character in the game. Even after a second playthrough, I still struggle to understand, let alone articulate certain parts of his character. We play at the idea he's willing to do something he would consider deplorable to reach the outcome he wants, but never elaborate on it. When he leaves the party, he suggests that he enjoyed his time and maybe wanted to continue, but this is the second to last time he speaks to the party. In fact, it's actually the last time, period, if the true ending is canon. And I still have no clue what he actually does after leaving. I guess it had to be setting up the chronophage because I can't think of anything else that's reasonable. Resh'an is a very underdeveloped character. That goes for most people in the cast, but it's no more evident than with him. Also, did his code with Aephorul end after Garl was shot or something? Need I remind you that Clone Resh'an directly fought against a dweller in the future world, and even though the real him is doing God knows what at this point, just someone using his alchemy was enough for Aephorul to take revenge. So what's the deal? Oh yeah, now that I think about it, that code needed to exist considering all the BS he's capable of. I didn't realize Mastery of Alchemy meant you could stop time and make clones of yourself with the snap of your finger. Why did he even need the flask? Actually, how did he never figure out how to fly? And now I want to very briefly touch on Bizet, or however you actually pronounce his name. Much like Resh'an, he's extremely underdeveloped, but this time around, it's not something that can be fixed without a major restructuring of the plot. Bizet simply comes way too late into the game to receive substantial development or characterization in a way that wouldn't disrupt the pacing, because that wasn't bad enough already. This hurts him on gameplay level too. Because he never levels up before this, you don't get to change his stats much. So even during the final boss, you run into the same problem as the start of the game, where you barely have enough MP to use more than one skill. Even then, his skills are too situational to be useful, and they're not very impressive visually either. And that's like the one thing I can appreciate about him, I guess. He at least looks cool and is well animated, but that's where my praise ends for this cardboard cutout reserve member. He's just one in a sea of characters who exist because they have the perfect skill set to get past an obstacle in the hero's path, removing the agency from said heroes. And the less I say about him mimicking Garl to save him, the better. Now we have Serai, someone who actually had a lot of potential to be interesting, but you wouldn't realize that unless you thought about it for any longer than it probably took to write her. I suppose one of her biggest issues is that she just acts as a convenient source of information. Information that, in some cases, is very debatable in whether or not she should know it. And then there's the fact that the story never fully grasped the implications of her portals. Despite them being shown to be so effective that they can let eclipse light into a cave and casually transport other people, the game will only selectively use them because the plot would change drastically if she did. It's kind of funny how she knows how to take the Vespertine and figured out how to do it without the coin. But when a bunch of port citizens need to go to a new island, she doesn't realize she could just teleport everyone there without hassle. She also knows enough about curses from a world she isn't from to know what's needed to break it and who has it, but when a big magic wall separates them from the potential cause of the apocalypse, she doesn't think to use her one defining power to get the jump on them. The idea that a character is only as smart as the one writing them continues to prove itself. She really is just a mess of a character.
There's more.
Here's a question I'm forced to ask because I thought about it for more than 3 seconds. How exactly did she get here? If you recall, it's established that in order to travel the Sea of Stars, you not only need permission from whoever gives it, but also a vessel capable of traveling across it. I can accept that the path to the sea in her world opened, even if I think Aephorul would have something to say about someone going to another world to find the one type of person who can stop him. The game just completely glosses over this part of her history. We never learn how she got here, when, what kind of vessel she used to get here, if she even used one at all. I guess you could just enter a new world without permissions from the giants on said world. Otherwise, I have no idea how she got here unless she used her portals, which would completely destroy the plot if that were the case. I think the writers really wanted her to be a double twist character, where you have this big shocking twist that follows another big twist that was meant to be obvious. The issue with that, as I mentioned before, is that if the writers treat something as a joke, then the audience has no reason to take it seriously. When you get to the reveal and see the characters act so nonchalant about it, not before getting a Steam achievement that continues to treat it as a joke, you just don't care. And when we get to her second twist, instead of answering questions that you ask throughout the story, you just end up with more questions. And can I just mention how dumb the premise of her side quest boss is? Not to repeat myself, but are we really to believe that a civilization with sky-based tech doesn't have the ability to find this apparent threat to their people without trekking through a desert? And even further than that, her main story involves dealing with going on an impossible quest to maybe save her world, which has already suffered irreversible damage as is. And the resolution to such a serious and tragic story is not contemplation or a glimpse into the attempts to rebuild their world, but instead this 2-frame dance animation. I really wish I was joking. And I guess that brings us to the protagonists. I don't have a whole lot to say about these characters, because there's not much to them to begin with. I have to give the devs props, they somehow made their main characters less characterized than your average silent protagonist. It'd be easy to compare these two to the protag of Chrono Trigger, but again, this video isn't meant to be a comparison, at least primarily. And I've talked about their lack of noticeable personality and passive behavior a number of times. However, my biggest issues with these two don't stem as much from the story, but instead from the fundamental design of the game itself, and how it relates to the story, but we'll get there. Strap in, college degrees apparently can't get you a lesson in game design 101, so I guess the duty falls on me. It can be pretty easy to forget what the RP in RPG stands for, mostly because it's used more or less as a blanket term for games with a similar turn-based gameplay and story progression. But, as the name implies, role-playing is a core aspect of the experience, as you would expect from a genre primarily inspired by D&D. Whether it's a fully written character to put you in their shoes, or a blank slate so you can essentially play as yourself, or anything in between. It's all in the art of immersion. Sea of Stars' protagonists sit in this weird middle road purgatory where they're too defined and linear to be a blank slate, and not developed or written well enough to be their own characters, leaving the player looking at their monitor, internally begging the game to give you a reason to care about them. And if I have to tell you why it's important for the player to care about the protagonist, we have a problem. It's pretty telling that the only time they come close to feeling like actual characters is when they interact with Garl. But a character having a relationship with another isn't the same as a character having defined traits. A relationship can certainly display these traits, but they are not the traits themselves. Evident in the fact that as soon as Garl is out of the picture, these two become a vacuous void of nothing. You really just can't bring yourself to care about them. And the most interesting thing is, the game doesn't seem to want you to. Even before you get into the game, you have to choose who to follow, and while a different game would make this a very important decision, one that could make you play the game in a completely different way, Sea of Stars, on the other hand, assures the two people who feel threatened by important choices in a genre where decision-making is a core part of the gameplay that they can freely switch them over if they want, and it doesn't matter who you pick at any given time. And what do you think this actually results in? Again, I have referred to Zale and Valir not by their names, but as the main duo, or something of the sort. The reason being that these two are so interchangeable by design that there's no reason to treat them as separate characters outside their visual design powers and like one story beat. Even Zale's big prophecy payoff was him learning to fly, but Valir learns how to do it in the same scene without any of the setup or build-up. All this in mind, it makes you wonder, why have them as separate main characters to begin with if they're so interchangeable and homogenous that they may as well be one character? Why not just have a game with a single protagonist? Well, I actually know the answer to that. They couldn't. The story of two adventurers going on a journey and eventually becoming gods was something that was already established in The Messenger. If Sea of Stars were to follow this story, it would need to have two characters at the forefront of the story. This isn't an excuse. Being consistent with your writing and world building is important after all, but that doesn't mean you should structure a story in an uninteresting way just to stay consistent. Of course, you also shouldn't sacrifice consistency for the sake of being interesting. Writing is a balancing act in that regard, and creative thinking is important here so you can find a way to make a structurally sound experience while keeping it compelling. In a way, this sort of relates to what I said earlier, about this game feeling like it was made by people who like RPGs despite having an unending list of nitpicks about very fundamental aspects of the genre. Again, RPGs are all about decisions. Why should you make a decision as major as picking your character explicitly worthless? I actually learned something late into writing that relates to my theory, but more on that towards the end. Of course, everything I've explained up to this point is little more than me explaining my general issues with the game and why I think it's bad. Now, why do I consider this my least favorite game of all time? Well, mostly expectations. I think it's fair to say that what you see in the marketing made this game look incredible. With everything I saw, I had no reason to expect something bad. So to have my trust as a consumer betrayed like that was an experience. Sure, someone with a more discerning eye could probably spot potential issues, but needless to say, I didn't. It ended up leaving a taste in my mouth so sour I could barely get my thoughts together. And after well over a year, 2 full completion playthroughs, an entire video essay script later, all roads lead to this conclusion. This is my least favorite game. Again, not the worst game I've played. Low expectations can only make you hate something so much, but my feelings toward this game are rivaled by no other game that I have played. I may have expected too much, but even if my expectations were relatively neutral, I would still be disappointed. Hell, if the game was just serviceable, like a 6 out of 10, I would still be disappointed, but I'd have little reason to hate it. Alas, the game wasn't good or serviceable. It was bad. Much worse than I remember, actually. But what if? Far be it from me to suggest that my ideas are the best. I'm not even remotely experienced enough to know what's best. Nor will I ever. But in the back of my mind, I knew that surely there was a better way to make this game. Making the game we got anywhere close to good is going to take more than 2 large updates. We need a complete overhaul. So, if you would allow me to stretch my creative muscles for a moment, then perhaps I could envision a better game, or at least a better baseline for the game. So, the story will be changed drastically. This time the choice of protagonist is much more significant, with very different perspectives of the same plot. So different that they start on different worlds. Some of the things will be taken out. Almost the entire supporting cast will be removed or altered. Some things will be similar. The general idea of the Solstice Warriors will remain. Dwellers, on the other hand, are different. This time still being made by Aephorul. However, that fact isn't known yet. And now, there's something of a dime a dozen. But the way they become stronger is made much more clear. This time, it's explicitly established that Dwellers gain power by feeding off of living beings. And there's even classifications for Dwellers of different power levels. Infant Dwellers are weak enough that a few knights could beat it. The older ones, or adult Dwellers, are threatening but don't require Solstice Warriors to be killed. The next tier up is Grand Dwellers, where they gain more individuality and require Solstice magic to be killed. And the final tier before World Eater are so strong that they require multiple warriors and an eclipse to be made vulnerable. These ones are named, but not in the same way as the actual game. More importantly, these ones have a level of intelligence to them, and only a handful are known throughout the universe, as the Solstice Warriors this time around are very competent at protecting the world. In fact, there is only one instance of a World Eater being created. This time around, the Solstice Warriors in each world are much more of a guild than an order, with the primary HQ being an academy like before. They take in teens who are able to use lunar or solar magic, but only those with notable aptitude. That's where our protagonists come in. They both enroll in their world's respective schools, and both are considered prodigies like none other. The other warriors and teachers believing that just one of them could defeat a Grand Dweller alone. Both ace their entrance exam to the amazement of the students and staff, and it's here where their stories play out differently, but still parallel to each other. More importantly, these differences are informed by their character traits. Our Solon this time around is established as a very outgoing, energetic, and cocky individual, while our Luana this time is noticeably more calm, quiet, and closed off. The two make waves in their schools, and as you would expect, Solon is very boastful about his abilities, acting like a show-off constantly, much to the dismay of his peers. Regardless, he plows through his lessons due to his innate talent, with moderate results on written tests. After graduating, he sets out on his own to reunite with his close friend who was established at the start before he left for the school, and who has been training to be an adventurer himself. They travel across the vast plains, fighting the occasional infant dweller and exploring the world. Things come to a head after they travel to a particular city, and hear musings of a nearby adult dweller that the guard has been struggling with. The two boys, more than confident that they alone could beat it, hunt it down. However, the thrill of battle goes to Solon's head. He prepares to deliver a final blow with a big fireball. The dweller is eviscerated, but his friend is hit in the process. Panicked, Solon rushes him to care. He makes it, but the injury is serious and he needs a while to recover. Some time passes, and before Solon can properly come to grips with what happened, he's alerted of a Grand Dweller that he must go dispatch of. He leaves without saying goodbye to his friend, and in the battle against the Grand Dweller, things go smoothly and Solon is commanded to deliver the final blow. But he hesitates. The Dweller is able to use this chance to strike back at the Solstice Warriors, but Solon comes to his senses and finishes it off. But the Dweller's final strike left many warriors severely injured, and one of them dying as a result. After dismissal, Solon sulks about with 1,000 questions and doubts on his mind. That's when his friend arrives, fully recovered, but scarred. Solon apologizes for what he's done and suggests that the two split ways, only for his friend to deck him in the head and say, "Have you forgotten why we're friends in the first place?" We get a flashback of them as kids, the first time they met. Solon protected him from some small angry animals, something that, while not life-threatening, was still scary to a kid as helpless as he was. "It's the same reason I trained myself all those years. I wanted to become someone you could count on, the same way I knew I could count on you ever since we met." Solon is speechless after hearing this. Then, he punches himself in the face. "You're right, man. I am an idiot. I can't believe I never thought of this before you pointed out. Guess there's only one way to make up for my mistakes. From now on, we always have each other's back. I promise." Luana's story plays out similarly, but almost opposite. Everyone at the school is amazed by her talents, but she doesn't know what to think about it. The years pass, she doesn't make any friends, and whenever she gets test results, she will stare at them and contemplate for up to hours on end. After graduating, she visits her family, who happen to live close by, for a short while. They too are amazed by her results, and Luana, once again, struggles to gather her thoughts. And when it's time to leave, she sets out on her own adventure alone as she has no real friends, let alone any who would be willing to go with her. But soon, she meets a curious hydromancer, and after noticing that Luana is a solstice warrior, asks for help. Not sure what else to do, Luana agrees. The hydromancer has a fascination with plant life and wants to investigate an area of a forest that suffered significant decay. However, she's a bit of a scaredy cat who doesn't enjoy fighting anything, so she wants someone else on that duty. After searching through the forest, they encounter an adult dweller of their own that appears to be the cause of the decay. Luana dispatches it effortlessly despite her companion's fear, but she's left with the same feeling as when she got all that praise during her school days. She starts asking if she should feel good about doing everything she did with little effort, so later, when the two of them continue to investigate the decay, multiple dwellers appear, but when fighting, Luana holds back. Her companion is fine, but Luana herself sustains heavy damage. She defeats them eventually, but doesn't get that feeling of satisfaction she thought she would. Her companion notices she was holding back and tries to figure out why, but Luana does what she's done her whole life and closes herself off. While she sulks, she's approached by a strange wandering apothecary. He notices her distress and tries to console her, but after she acts unresponsive, he talks of an old friend of his that she reminds him of. The friend in question had remarkable talents, but nobody around him could appreciate it because they couldn't see past the surface of what he did, and the two men became friends because the apothecary was amazed by what he did. I'm not saying the two of you are the same. However, whatever troubles you're facing may not be possible to overcome in the way you think, and perhaps a friend of yours will be able to help you find your answer, or maybe a new friend altogether. The apothecary then appears to be alerted by something and says his farewells. Now armed with new insight, Luana returns to the hydromancer and asks for a favor. Will you be my friend? Oh sure, I'd love to. I've actually never had any real friends. Always nose deep in my research, you know. I can't wait to see what it's like to have one. And it's after this time in the story when Solon is contacted by someone in a navy blue gi and a mask asking for their help. And Luana is setting off to fight a Grand Dweller, not after being stopped by a mysterious masked man dressed in crimson robes. The two protagonists will soon set off on the Sea of Stars, meet up, and together find out the truth about the Dwellers and eventually ascend into godhood. Again, by no means the best route for the story, but just by doing a bit of occasional brainstorming during the writing for this video script, I hope I've properly demonstrated that there is not just one route for a story that already has a beginning and end. I'm sure people will be quick to point out that this version is a lot more tropey than the actual game, and if you think my version of the Dwellers sounds like the Menos Grande hierarchy from Bleach, you're not wrong. But to that I say, first, what's wrong with taking pointers from Bleach? Second, I get that Sabotage is more or less at war with the concept of cliches, but it's worth noting the difference between tropes and cliches. At least in writing, a trope is something that stories have in common with each other, reoccurring ideas and all that, while a cliche is a story element that is seen as overused. I guess this is the part where I say something weird. I think the only reason that cliches exist is because tropes work. Think about it, especially nowadays with our much more competitive creative environment. If you want to make a story that people like, you naturally want to look at what worked in the past. This mentality, of course, leads to a lot of stories having similarities, i.e. tropes. And some people will naturally try to replicate this and just do the same thing as other successes without any understanding of why those tropes work in the first place, i.e. cliches. So yeah, I don't think leaning into writing tropes is inherently a bad thing. It just takes a bit of finesse. Though back to my version of Sea of Stars, there's plenty more to my changes that go beyond make plot structure good. Placing the two mains on different worlds was obviously done to have two meaningfully different storylines. But if done right, it can also allow the story to introduce its namesake much earlier in the plot, making it a much more significant component of the story, as well as possibly the game's structure. I also chose a ninja to guide one party to the main plot because I want there to be better connections between this and the messenger. A lot of the real game just doesn't seem very congruent with it. For example, let's say we're keeping the 4 acolytes like I suggested in the summary. Obviously, they should be written to be more interesting, but if they become the mind of the Demon King, then why not have their masks resemble the cursed one that Phantom wore? Of course, I also think that Resh'an and Aephorul's dynamic has too much untapped potential just to be scrapped. So even though the Father of Dwellers is an elusive force this time around, the Alchemist will be a much more active player in supporting the soon-to-be gods' journey, even if that means he can't be a party member this time. Now obviously the protagonists got the biggest changes. The most important change for me was to make sure they actually develop as characters. I shouldn't have to say this, but in a story where the goddamn premise is that the main characters literally become something else, they should change. Obviously I only came up with the opening act, but I think that my version not only provides solid character arcs early on, but also sets up plenty of room for future arcs and development. You can even tie this into the gameplay by having the unlocking of new combo attacks be tied to story moments, optional or otherwise. And as for the two new characters, I chose our warrior as a bit of a Garl stand-in. Someone who can't use magic in a magical fantasy setting is ripe with potential. I chose that moment with the critters to be the moment when friendship with him and Solon started, since it can inform his loyalty to his friends, as he saw firsthand how important being protective is. Luana's new friend was given hydromancy due to the relation of the moon and the ocean tides, and character-wise, having two people who seem different at first glance yet are able to bond over an unexpected similarity could make for an interesting dynamic, especially when they start opening up with each other. Put all this together and you have, at least, the groundwork for one hell of a game.
Like that's ever gonna happen.
Fun fact, I replayed The Messenger to record footage for this video, yes, but I replayed it earlier, shortly after finishing Sea of Stars for the first time, just to see if it held up under a much more pessimistic eye. And while I noticed some of the smaller issues with the game, as a whole, still good. And liking this game certainly made the Sea of Stars experience worse. Yeah, there's the lost goodwill that comes with the disappointment, but I also have to ask why they chose to tell this story first. The Messenger ended on not one, but two cliffhangers. And to have the next game set in this universe not follow up on them, just to give unsatisfactory origin stories for things and characters that didn't need them, leaves an additional yet strange sour taste in my mouth. Like, the ending of Sea of Stars is actually pretty bleak when you think about it. Aephorul is still at large, the World Eaters will continue to be made, the Dweller of Strife will return at their world's most vulnerable state and torture humanity's few survivors for uncountable eons, and our two heroes will have all their effort be for naught as people stop worshipping them and they're left to wait at the bottom of the ocean for their turn to do one single thing to fix this situation. And after all this playing, recording, and writing, I can't help but ask how the game ended up being this bad to begin with. I imagine that the fundamental reason was that Sabotage just severely overestimated themselves. Making an action platformer and making a story-driven RPG are two very different things that require very different skills and attitudes. To make matters worse, even though The Messenger is a good game, it doesn't display that they had the knowledge or expertise to tackle this genre, let alone the legacy of one of the most legendary games of all time. And the idea that they were confident enough to go through with it displays a certain arrogance on the part of the devs. But even with everything I know about these two games, all these explanations don't go beyond educated guesswork. I haven't found a proper, concrete answer to these theories. So, I looked into it. Not even a minute of searching later, and I found this interview with Thierry Boulanger, the CEO of Sabotage and writer-director for both their games. This interview was done after the release of the Sea of Stars demo, so he couldn't disclose anything major about the full game, but even still, some of what he said adds a surprising amount of credence to my theories and assumptions regarding the devs' mentality making this. So let's go through it one by one. It's an attempt to take things that work from other games and just combine them with no thought of how they would work together. When asked about any games that the team had in mind when planning, Thierry says, well, it's hard not to mention Chrono Trigger, obviously. And obviously, Super Mario RPG, the Paper Mario games for timing the hits and timing the inputs. The idea was, let's put together these things, because it seemed like no game had it all, you know? Well, buddy, there's a reason for that. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, appeal to all and you appeal to none, or something similar. Trying to do all the things inherently means that there's less focus on each of those things. Even if one particular thing is important, there is less room to work on that thing. One of the reasons Chrono Trigger's combat works so well is because of how deep it is in spite of, or rather because of, how simple it is. Taking the idea of that combat system and adding more things from other games onto it for the sake of being an all-in-one package is a dangerous game to play, and not one that can be won without careful consideration. Mechanical depth is not the same as mechanical density, and if what you're adding on works against some of the present mechanics, the game will suffer for it. It feels like this game was made by people who do enjoy RPGs, but have a ton of nitpicks with most of them. When asked about parts of the JRPG genre they wanted to improve or expand upon, our previous game was an action platformer, and it always comes from a list of the known irritants or things we feel we could improve upon. However, if we made games that were exactly like those games, then well, you don't miss the stiff controls, you don't miss the unfair difficulty spikes, you don't miss the lengthy bits that just add playtime but don't meaningfully impact your experience. This quote has a similar issue with Yalande's meta humor in that, unknowingly or not, it's hypocritical. Sea of Stars has smooth controls, but I guess difficulty spikes and meaningless filler isn't a problem when it's in your game. But moreover, this once again suggests a level of arrogance when making this game. If you want to make a game that improves on aspects of another, you first need to properly understand what does or doesn't work about that game. So there are 6 playable characters in total in the game. That's something we're saying. So people understand this is not like Final Fantasy VI where you get, 25 or something. Again, the arrogance on display. Firstly, FF6 has 10 party members, 14 if you count the optional ones. Secondly, the way you say this comes across as if you've never even played FF6, despite it apparently being the new source of nostalgia bait in the upcoming DLC. You go on to talk about how your characters are all handcrafted and unique and shit, but the FF6 cast all have uniqueness to them, both story and gameplay wise. In fact, they were probably more handcrafted than your characters thanks to the existing limitations in technology. This particular quote genuinely makes me wonder if you even care about the genre you're tackling. And if this is your attitude towards FF6, how could you possibly take on the legacy of a game like Chrono Trigger? Not to turn into a history lesson, but Chrono Trigger was made by 3 veterans. Hironobu Sakaguchi, who at the time was the producer of the Final Fantasy series, Yuji Horii, designer and creator of Dragon Quest, and of course the now late Akira Toriyama, who needs no introduction. So yeah, take one of the most beloved storytellers of all time, pair him up with 2 people who are more than experienced enough with making JRPGs, and is it any wonder why Chrono Trigger is as good as it is? I'm sorry to say, Thierry, but you nor anyone at your studio has half the experience needed to live up to that legacy, let alone be able to make it an experience that can improve upon Chrono Trigger. Look, I fully believe that no art made, past, present, or future, is perfect, but that should not stop us from trying to achieve it. Not by suddenly making the perfect game, but by making games that always find ways to improve themselves. It seems like the success of The Messenger may have gone to your head, made you think that you were ready to take on a giant, and that nobody would be able to stop you because, by all accounts, the throwback game scene isn't very contested by anyone other than indie devs. But that's been ever so slowly changing recently, and that's a good thing. It means you can no longer be comfortable with a built-in audience who yearns for games like that. And you'll have to step up your game, pun intended. Not by overindulging in excessive and frankly unnecessary presentation, but rather by making the entire experience of the game better. Now, there's one more quote from this interview that I think explains much more about the failures of this game than any other. It puts things into a whole new perspective, and while I had my suspicions that this was the case because of that last story from the shopkeeper, this part of the interview confirms it beyond a shadow of a doubt. When asked why Sea of Stars was set in the same universe as The Messenger, Thierry responds, "I don't really have an answer for that. I've been building this fantasy world in my head since I was in elementary school, and we're just basically telling some of the big arcs of that whole thing. So it's not like we made The Messenger and then thought, hey, let's reuse that setting, or something. It was kind of always that Sea of Stars was always there, and what comes before and what comes after is already there as well. We just happen to be telling this specific chapter in this order. So that was kind of always the plan. Let's make a studio and all the games happen in the same universe." Whether he realized it or not, the biggest mind behind this game openly admitted to committing one of the deadly sins of creative writing: being attached. There's no doubt in my mind that this universe is incredibly important to him, but take it as someone who, as a kid, similarly dreamed about making video games. Take the ideas you came up with as a kid with a grain of salt. Pretty much every skill you have in your life is one that has to be nurtured through practice and learning to improve over time. Any creative idea you think up as a kid is far more likely to be a bad or misguided one because your best ideas are just repeating what you've seen in things you like. And you inherently lack the maturity to think critically enough about why you like something beyond pointing at the TV screen and telling your parents you like it. And if you're so attached to your childhood dream that you can't look at your ideas and ask yourself, is this a good idea? Then the quality of the final product is entirely dependent on luck. It's clear that these games are a passion project for you, but don't let what you want get in the way of what someone else would want. co-creators, consumers, or otherwise. Sea of Stars as a whole is a complete waste. A waste of the time, effort, and money that went into making it, a waste of the time and money used to play it, a waste of goodwill, a waste of the space on my hard drive, a waste of the space in my Steam library, a waste of my brain's memory, and perhaps most unfortunately, a waste of Mitsuda's talent as a musician. Seriously, this man's resume is incredible, and he got wasted on this game just so his name could be used in the marketing. Now, this is usually the part of the video where I say I don't mean any ill intent towards the devs and how I wish them the best and blah blah. While I wouldn't be lying if I said that, it wouldn't be particularly honest either. I know for a fact that these guys are capable of making good games, but if this is what follows up from the success of those games, how can I expect anything better from them going forward? Thierry said in that interview that after the success of The Messenger, their studio basically quadrupled in size and budget, and instead of using those resources to make games of a bigger scope than what they could accomplish, or similar scope games at a faster rate, they had the misguided idea that they should use this to make sure that every environment in the game never reuses a single asset. I'm not saying that Sea of Stars had a bloated and mismanaged budget, but Sea of Stars may have had a bloated and mismanaged budget. Not like it didn't pay off for them. The praise this game got is absurd, and really, I do not for a second believe that it was earned. So after a big increase in budget followed by wild praise, do I think that Sabotage will be capable of making good games in the future? Well, not really. What interests me is that they clearly thought there was room to improve, otherwise they wouldn't have released that update. But considering that the changes made either barely changed anything, improved something asterisk, or made the game worse, they clearly don't understand what the actual issues with the game are. And if they can't figure that out, how will the story update be any better than the main game? How will they make a new game that's better? If Sea of Stars is representative of the direction the studio is taking with their games, then I have no interest in their future projects, especially if their incompetence gets rewarded like this. And to anyone who thinks that this game actually deserved Indie Game of the Year, well, not to sound condescending or elitist, but maybe expand your palette a bit, because indie games have much more and better to offer. I'll even give a few recommendations. For something that's way more deserving of the award, well, obviously Pizza Tower needs no introduction because it was pretty viral, and for good reason. The story is simple and easy to follow, the levels are great with tons of variety, the bosses kick ass, and man does it encourage you to master it. Or you could check out Gravity Circuit. It's a really nifty take on the Mega Man formula. The ways you can customize are great, the gameplay is smooth, snappy, fast-paced, and yeah, it's probably gonna kick your ass. Outside of 2023, if you need a good-ass RPG, then you should look into Crystal Project. The combat is solid and the class customization is great, but the exploration is easily the best part. It's worth playing for that alone, and it even has workshop support. And for recent releases, you can try out Rift of the Necrodancer. I'm not a rhythm game guy, and I am absolute cheeks at this game, but being bad at something is rarely this fun. And a recent release that I strongly recommend. Oh, I guess that was it. I mean, hey, if movies can slow down in the early new year, then I guess it's not unreasonable to expect the same from video games. Especially expect anything that's truly worthwhile. I'm just playing with you. What a truly unexpected event. Where was I? And for recent releases, you can try out Rift of the Necrodancer. I'm not a rhythm game guy, and I am absolute cheeks at this game, but being bad at something is rarely this fun. And a recent release that I strongly recommend, No Skin. I dare not spoil anything about this game for the sake of a 10-second recommendation, but it's something that can only be described as an endless rabbit hole. It's a surreal experience the whole way through in the best possible way, and it always finds ways to surprise you. Please check it out, it's more than worth your time. I'll link the Steam pages for every game I mentioned in the description. Hell, I'll even link the Messenger and the Steam port of Chrono Trigger. But at this point, I've said my piece with Sea of Stars. In summary, it's a confused mess of gameplay inspirations that did not work together, an incompetent story that thinks it's smarter than it is, a shallow husk of something great, a misguided creative vision from the mind of someone who doesn't understand what makes the source of his inspirations great to begin with, and one that gets by not because it's actually good, but just because it looks pretty. I mean, credit where it's due, they prove that you can in fact polish a turd. I give Sea of Stars a very generous 2.5 out of 10. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna play The Messenger on New Game Plus. Holy moly, I actually managed to finish a video. You never thought you'd see the day, did ya? Well, neither did I. First of all, if you made it to the end of this video, well, holy shit, thank you so much for watching. This has been an undertaking and a half for me. I really do hope you enjoy it. Also, since this video marks a return from hiatus, I want to take this time to sort of just explain where I plan to take this channel now that it's over. As far as what videos you can expect from me in the future, well, probably something pretty similar to what you just watched. Not a channel that makes 2.5-hour video essays about video games, but just as a channel that makes videos about video games. It's hard to say what videos will come in the future, but I do have at least one idea in mind for what I'll do. And before you ask, no, I don't plan on making a video about the DLC for a hot minute. You have to understand, this took a long-ass time for me. Not only am I not used to making videos like this, but especially of this scope. I started work on this late January, and I have been working on it on and off for, like, no less than 4 months. On top of that, no, I never planned on releasing this as the same date as the release for the DLC. However, the stars just kind of aligned on that one. Including the scripting and recording and all that, I'd say the video was about like 60% done by the time the release date was announced. So I basically spent the entirety of May using whatever off time I had in between my part-time job and Marvel Rivals addiction to work on this. So at this point, I am completely burnt out on this game. That being said, I do want to talk about it at some point in the future. I just need to build a motivation again. And I'll tell you what, I will without doubt do it if this video makes at least $1. Fair deal, right? But like I said, I do have some ideas outside of that for what I want to make in the future. Although it does go without saying that any videos I was planning on making before my hiatus have been all but completely abandoned. That being said, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you look forward to more from me in the future. Speaking of which, you probably surmised this just by watching this video. Although I never said it explicitly, I do actually want to make video games at some point. Although that is very far down the pipeline. I am nowhere close to being able to do it. But either way, if you want to stay updated on that and what I'm doing, just subscribe to the channel and keep an eye on the community tab, because this will be the one-stop shop for all things me. Yeah, I don't plan on making any external social media sites, so just stick to this channel and you'll be good. Hard to say what the future holds now that this video is out, but, you know, hopefully it's worth looking forward to. I don't have a whole lot to say now. This outro is unscripted, and I don't even have bullet points to follow, so yeah. Stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, keep an eye on the community tab, and I guess I'll see you next time. And, oh yeah, enjoy some outtakes. I think you've earned it. So yeah, that'll be it for me. Till next time. First, this dialogue is optional, so it doesn't interrupt the pace. Yeah, we're about to paste all these jokes on this game, I guess. Also, if wind mages are important for propelling strips, he and Erlina confront them when they make it. He and Erlina. I hate these names. You need to go all the way through Clock Castle to get with her. No, I get with her. No, she is unattractive as fuck. I don't want that. When you get to the reveal and you see the characters act nonchalant, I guess. When you get to the reveal and see the characters act When you get to the reveal and see the characters act oh, fucking hell. This line is impossible. When you get to the reveal and see the characters act so nonchalant about it, not before getting a Steam achievement that continues to treat it as a joke, you just don't care. Oh god, how many attempts did that take me?